Monsters by JawJoe. Converted to audiobook by ARandomAudiobookAppeared. Category, My Little Pony. Genre, gore, drama, dark, mystery. Words, 115,226. Summary. 2 decades after the banishment of Nightmare Moon, her shadow still lingers. Princess Celestia has been left to tend the twin thrones alone and protect us all from those who would see Equestria crumble. Our enemies take many forms, some would tear the world down with their claws, others with their smiles. They are monsters all the same. I have had many names, and I have been many things. Today I am Swift Sweep, and I work for the Equestrian Bureau for State Security. Chapter 1. Vivisect. Swift Sweep. The thing about the Secret Service is that every pony knows it exists. The Equestrian Bureau for State Security listened for the conspiratorial whispers of plans to overthrow Princess Celestia. We scanned the shadows that the light of the sun could not touch to find those who would have seen our nation crumble. Where the rest of the royal guard had no grounds to act, we would go in their place. Where their hooves could no longer reach, ours were there. We were the elite of the elite, the princess most trusted, Equestria's first and last line of defense. The way I saw it, our job was to hunt monsters. Tonight, we had 3 of them to catch. The cart drove over a pothole, shaking the cabin. The lone lantern that hung from the ceiling swung erratically, and shadows danced on our black suits of armor. Twilight Grotto, the only unicorn for us 3 Pegasi, sat closest to the cabin's back. With narrowed eyes, he poked an armored hoof under the curtain separating us from the city outside. A little patch of dark purple hair protruded from a joint in his leg where one metal plate met another. Our armor was not at all like the decorative tin suits of the Royal Guard. Whereas theirs was lightweight and served more to amaze the common folk than to protect its wearer, ours was the opposite, thick and heavy and covered the entire pony, inside. Metal latches and magical seams held the entire suit together and ensured a tight fit, a few loose hairs notwithstanding. River Flow sat across from Twilight Grotto, his helmet in his hooves. He didn't like wearing it, he had a hard time breathing as it was, without layers of chainmail and plate choking him. I couldn't help but glance at the thick scar across his throat, the mark of a spear that once tore it open. If I hadn't found him back then, he'd have bled out writhing on the floor in a puddle of his own blood and spit. He eyed his helmet as though it were a criminal looking defiantly back at him. With a raspy sigh, he put the helmet on the floor and turned his hooves up to check his jagged horseshoes. They were on the blunt side and ran a serious lack of polish. River had always been a brash sort, rather grim, fond and eager to use the jagged horseshoes. Sometimes I wondered whether bashing some pony's face in was the only thing he liked. River's eyes danced onto Twilight Grotto's hoof under the curtain. "Wouldn't do that, boss," he grumbled in that terrible gravelly voice of his. It was like he chewed on your eardrums every time he opened his mouth, or some pony was chewing on his vocal cords. Grotto retracted his hoof and smiled apologetically under his helmet. "Bad habit." River reached for his helmet and pulled it over his head, then fastened its latches and hoists to his collar armor. He kept his visor open, though. Lullaby and I sat opposite to one another at the other end of the cabin. She extended her wings, carving the floor with the tips of her wing blades. I ruffled my wings, my feathers brushed against my enchanted armor. "Ready to dance, big girl?" She turned her eyes up at me and pulled her wing blades out of the floor with a jerk, rattling her armor. She closed her visor, but through the breaths I could see her grin. "When aren't I, small boy?" I turned the other way to slightly pull aside the curtain on our end. A mare and a stallion pulled our cart across the Candrelot night. This city district had been built specifically for the spoilt brats of nobles. Private mansions lined the mountainside, their pristine white walls, clear ponds, and gem-encrusted fountains glistening in the moonlight. If I ever felt bitter, however, I only needed to turn my head a little. The half-built spires of Celestia's new palace loomed distantly over us, a sobering reminder of whom all the land truly belonged to. As for the 2 that pulled our cart, they both had their heads hung and focused solely on their task, though I could see the glint of the stallion's gritted teeth. Their muscles rippled under their skin as they performed the workhorse's menial job, and good on them, I thought, for drawing all this weight on their own. Even though I never thought much of these 2, I still appreciated them in their own way. I could never memorize their names, though I had been meaning to. They worked for the EBSS just like us, after all, and on paper, there was no distinction between our ranks. The difference came with age. They, and all the new recruits like them, were little more than toddlers at the time of Princess Luna's banishment and joined the organization only in recent years. The rest of us had been working with the EBSS since its establishment directly after that longest night. But 20 years is 20 years, and Celestia needed fresh meat for the grinder. Lullaby had overheard this pair begrudgingly call us veterans the old dogs. I took a quick liking to that term, it suited us, I found. Per Twilight Grotto's suggestion, we had been calling the kids puppies ever since. They did not like it, not the slightest bit. Although our work required mutual respect, the truth of the matter was that the puppies and the old dogs never got along. They hated us for treating them like the snotty-nosed, ignorant babies they were. We pitied them because they did not know the truths behind the foundation of the EBSS, our secrets within secrets. It was better that way for all of us. I let go of the curtain and sat still, closing my eyes. I always took a moment to relax and gather myself before a field mission. In just a few minutes, the cart came to a halt. Twilight Grotto lifted a hoof to the side of his helmet's side. Muffled voices echoed inside, and he set his eyes on the curtain. Well, at least the sounds were voices to him. The enchantments in his helmet tapped into his own magic through his horn. Since the rest of us had not been blessed with horns of our own, all we could make out were unintelligible scraping noises. When the scraping went silent for a moment, Grotto shot us a glance. Yes. His hoof wandered under the curtain again. There came some more scraping from his helmet, then it died with a click. Grotto lifted his visor as he turned to us. This is it. He dropped his visor, and so did Lullaby and I drop ours. River was the last to close his. We needed no more words, for we didn't have time for them. If they didn't know we were here, they would soon enough. Lullaby sent me a nod, and I fluttered my wing blades in turn. She turned to the curtain, and I did as well. Grotto stood up. 1. He tensed for a jump. 2. He jumped, his hooves catching the curtain and tearing it from its hangers. The street resounded as the heavily armored stallion slammed into the pavement, the fallen curtain doing little to ease the impact. River jumped after him, then Lullaby, and finally I. The pulverized pavement crunched under my hooves like fresh snow. It was a two-story building, one among the many luxurious residences along the street. 4 doors, one on each side, with a garden in the back. Grotto ran left, and River ran right. Lullaby and I followed a few paces behind them. She rounded the right corner after River, and I took my place at the front door. In 2 seconds, Grotto and Lullaby would secure the side doors. In another, River would reach the veranda at the back. I turned around, shifting weight to my front legs. 1. My old bones creaked under my armor as I lifted my hind legs. I felt blood rush into my head as my shoulders stiffened under the weight. 2. Enchanted gears ground on one another at my flanks and the armor's inner runes left marks of heat on my skin. 3. Ready or not, here I come. I bucked the door with crushing force, splintering the doorframe and sending the broken door flying into the foyer. As I stumbled reeling from the crash, I heard a mare scream. I trampled over the broken door and spread my wing blades wide. An earth pony, mare skidded to a halt before me, her expression one of terror. A cloaked unicorn stopped on the stairs behind her, and an earth stallion bumped into her on his way down. Sorry, folks. Front doors taken. These were our targets, an earth pony, brother and sister, and their mysterious unicorn benefactor. They were all part of the Children of the Night, a cult that worshipped Nightmare Moon as some sort of messianic deity. To say they were a splinter in Princess Celestia's eye would be putting it mildly. The cloaked unicorn was our prime target, whose name only whispers carried across the night. They called her Priestess Nyx, and what little we had pieced together from hushed scraps of information painted her as dangerous as she was elusive. For the longest time, we couldn't be certain she existed at all. Yet here she was now, just as Intel said she'd be. Nyx's long cape and hood fluttered as she jumped to the bottom of the stairs. Around her neck hung an ornate amulet whose central red gem shone in the light of the chandelier. A ceremonial knife followed her in the air, glowing with her horn's red light. The stallion stayed up on the stairs. You said we'd be safe. His sister stood paralyzed by fear, eyes wide and teeth clenched as she slowly shrunk away. I approached her slowly, deliberately, didn't want to scare her away yet. I set my hooves and prepared for my favorite part, the inevitable chase. It should begin right about now. 3 doors on 3 sides of the room burst open in the same second. Twilight Grotto emerged from a dining room on the left, and Lullaby stepped in from a sitting room on the right. River Flow threw open the double doors of the library behind the stairs. I saw Nyx's teeth glint under her hood as her horn brightened. A tuft of blood-red magic yanked the other mare's mane to shake her out of shock, and the knife flung itself towards the stallion on the stairs. And here we go. He caught the knife's handle between his teeth and turned to rush up the stairs. River Flow bolted after him. In the same moment, Nyx's magic yanked his sister to the left before she bolted the same way, straight towards Twilight Grotto, who set his hooves in the doorway of the dining room. Lullaby and I lunged after Nyx and the mare. Nyx ran ahead, magic pulling the frightened mare behind her, and they refused to stop. Grotto pointed his horn forward as he braced for impact. Nyx flashed her horn and jerked her head. The door slammed into Grotto, breaking in 2 at the impact and knocking him off balance. Before he could get up, she flashed her horn again. A red bolt of magic threw Grotto straight back into the dining room and sent him smashing across the dining room. The runes lining our armor's insides didn't just increase our strength and endurance, but also served to dampen the effects of magical bursts. This gear made each of us an unstoppable force and immovable object all in one, almost as good as Princess Luna's night guards of old. That is to say, Grotto getting thrown like a ragdoll should not have been possible. While Grotto clambered out of the remains of the wainscot, Nyx and the mare rushed past him, and Lullaby and I were right behind them. A long, fancy table divided the dining room in 2, ornate chairs on both sides. Nyx ran by the right wall, and the earth mare picked the left. Lullaby followed a step behind the mare as I tailed Nyx. They were fast, surprisingly so. All the better, I thought. I needed a good workout anyway. Lullaby threw her visor open to bite on the mare's tail and yank her back. The mare lost balance and fell over. Lullaby jumped across her and continued after Nyx. Nyx ran on without looking back at her captured friend. Seconds before reaching the door at the far end, she jumped over the table and hurled it at me with a kick of her hind legs. As she reached for the door handle, Lullaby rammed her into the wall. Nyx threw her off with a flash of her horn and a magical blast, then turned to take off running again. I dove in hoof first from the other side, slamming her head into the wall before she could charge another spell. Lullaby grabbed Nyx's front hooves and twisted them against her chest to push her against the wall. She spread her wings and slammed the blades deep into the wall around Nyx to cage her in. I picked an inhibitor off my belt, a mask-like device etched with runes that covered a unicorn's forehead and horn. Lullaby's wings held Nyx in place while she clasped our quarry's head to quell her futile struggles. Flicking her hood off revealed a light blue-coated mare snarling madly at us under a head of scraggy, milk-white mane. Her breaths came shallow and fast, but she was altogether quiet. The fire burning in her violet eyes as her gaze bounced between us did the talking for her. So helpless, so pathetic. There were few sights I liked more than a monster in a cage. She seemed surprisingly young, somewhere in her late teens. How she came to have the impressive magical strength she had showcased baffled me. We had ways to make her tell us, of course. The very thought made me smile. When her horn lit up, I quickly slipped the inhibitor onto her horn. The light of her horn fizzled out as the restraint clicked into place. I put a hoof under her chin. Better luck next time. She growled and bit my hoof, looking me in the eye and showing her gums in a snarl as her teeth scraped my armor. Heavy Yol, Lullaby sighed. Glad that's over. I'm not. I moved my hoof, and Nyx kept her teeth clenched on it. I could have kicked out her teeth right there, but I figured there would be time for that later. Behind us, Twilight Grotto stood above the earth mare, her front hooves cuffed to her hind ones. No, she pleaded, please, please no, don't take me away. I can't, Grotto raised one jagged horseshoe above her head, to which she immediately reduced her pleas to quiet whimpers. I turned back to Nyx and slipped her a wink. Too easy. Grotto nodded towards Nyx. You tied her up yet? I took a pair of cuffs off my belt and gave them to Lullaby. I'll let you do the honors. Oh, you're too kind, she said, taking them into her mouth. The ceiling rumbled under heavy hooves above. There came the sound of glass breaking, a muffled smash and grunt, then the sound of some pony hitting the floor. I turned my head up and shouted, "Break something!" A pained cry that most definitely didn't belong to River Flow answered first. "Not yet," followed River's raspy, muffled voice. Twilight Grotto rolled his eyes. "You be good up there, you hear?" No answer, only the clops and smacks of a thrashing pony, being dragged across the floor. "Well then," mumbled Lullaby, spitting the cuffs into her hooves. With her wings still pinning Nyx to the wall, Lullaby took one of her legs, and Nyx immediately pulled it back. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said. "You've got nowhere to go." Nyx crossed her legs and closed her eyes, shaking her head and rocking her body. Lullaby reached for one of her hooves again. "Look, I don't like hurting ponies, but I will if I have to. Do I have to?" Nyx pulled her hoof back again, but Lullaby yanked it up and twisted it. Nyx winced, she gave a pained groan and finally opened up to look Lullaby in the eye. As she moved to tie her legs together, a grin crept up Nyx's cheeks. "What's so funny?" I asked. That's when I noticed, the tip of Nyx's horn glowing, bright enough to shine through the inhibitor's black metal. The redness seethed until you couldn't tell the inhibitor was on at all. The cuffs slipped from Lullaby's grasp. "What in they?" A roaring explosion blasted across the room, blinding and deafening, sending me tumbling across the air. The heat in my armor seared my skin. When I could open my eyes, I found myself on the floor inside a burning room. Broken, darkened planks hung from the sunken ceiling, and draperies hung torn and burned from the walls, sparks racing on the edges. The many chairs, black and broken, lay scattered around the room, their cushioned soft beds for embers. Half the long table was gone, reduced to sizzling cinders where the blast had hit. My ears rang, I couldn't hear a thing. Dust and soot swelled in the air, getting in my eyes and making me cough and sneeze, and through the haze, I saw Nyx make her escape. I jumped to my hooves to give chase without another thought. The dining room opened into a kitchen, and from there a narrow corridor led past a number of servants' rooms. As Nyx ran, the hallway echoed with her laughter, gloating, confident, arrogant. That was when it got personal. How dare she make a fool of me? Her laughter etched itself into my memory and made me as fast as I had been in my prime. I'd wiped that hideous grin off her face. My jagged horseshoes tore into the floor, splintering parquet and shredding rich carpets in every room we passed. As she ran through a sitting room, her horn flashed red and slammed the door shut before me. I had no time or will to stop, I rammed it free from its hinges, ignoring the pain. Breaking through, I saw the tip of her tail zip around a corner. We emerged in a long hallway lined by tall windows on one side, overlooking the veranda at the back. Gradually, I began closing the distance between us, though I couldn't run any faster, Nyx was slowing down. "Getting tired, little filly?" She set her hooves and slid to a halt, spinning around as she did. I had a split second to look at her grin before her magic enveloped me. She used my momentum to whip me around, and her magic slammed me through a window like a stone from a sling. I hit the ground in a rain of glass shards. They fell through the breadths of my visor and collected in my helmet, pricking and tearing my skin. As I rolled to a stop, I saw Nyx leap over me, onto the veranda then out into the garden. I jumped up in time to see her trample across the flower beds and skip onto the ornate stone wall at the back. There, for just a second, she stood still. Moonlight shone on her cape and hood, her slender form silhouetted against the night sky. She pulled her hood back and whipped her unkempt mane from her face, grinning triumphantly at me. The inhibitor dangled loosely from her horn, its metal twisted and clasps split. I jumped for the wall, managed to grab on, and wedged my wing blades into the stone for support. Nyx casually skipped back along the wall with the nimbleness of a cat. I heard a snap, a sudden sharp pain jabbed my flank. My wing blades slid out of the wall with a jerk and I fell back to the ground. One of my leg plates had burst open, and in the hole I saw a rune-inscribed gear click and clack on a broken axle. While I collected myself, there came the clattering of light armor and the flapping of wings above, the Royal Guard. Nyx took one glance at the sky before looking back at me. She winked before hopping down the other side. As she disappeared behind the wall, I caught a glimpse of her amulet glinting in the moonlight. Exhausted, I sprawled out on the grass. The broken gear on my leg cast sparks and spun, tearing hairs and grazing skin. I bashed the back of my head into the ground. After a moment spent sniffing dirt and catching my breath, I pulled myself up. That's when I noticed just how much my ears were ringing, and my head was splitting with it. That blast! Royal guards swarmed in the air, squadrons of Pegasi flying this way and that. I had no faith that they'd catch the mare. If they had been that competent, they wouldn't have needed us. Or maybe I was just bitter and too proud to admit the years were catching up with me. Some stallions my age were seeing their grandchildren by now. I gradually eased weight onto my hurt leg and hobbled back to the mansion. As I was about to enter the back door, another armor-clad stallion came rushing out. I shook my head. She's gone, River. Gah! He groaned, gurgling phlegm in his throat. What by nightmare moon's full-eating fangs was that? Nyx got through the inhibitor, I replied, stepping inside. I don't know how. All I knew was I had to catch her. He shoved me. Astounding job. I trust you've at least got the others. Of course we did. Or at least I caught my mark. Can't say the same about you ponies. 3 on 2, and you managed to let one slip away. He rushed on ahead. Remind me why I don't lead this project. By the time we arrived in the dining room again, or what was left of it, the royal guards had already descended on the building. Unicorns used their magic to douse the fires and prop the weakened structure as ponies wearing white coats tended to the wounded. A number of white coats worked in the middle of the room. Looking above their shoulder, I saw the sister on her side, twitching and gasping shallow breaths, eyes dancing frantically. Her side facing up was all but devoid of hair, crisp, red cracks traced across her blistered, burnt skin. With every breath, bloody spittle leaked through her teeth, and her entire body convulsed erratically. The cuffs that bound her hooves had heated up in the blast, burning off skin and exposing blackened, cauterized flesh. The white coats exchanged a round of nods and affirmative grunts before lifting her onto a stretcher. River didn't stay to watch, he left while grumbling something about needing to take the brother back to the cart. Where Lullaby had pinned Nyx, there was now a crater in the wall that rivaled the size of a grown stallion. Wedged into the stone behind the broken wainscot hung a solitary, torn wing, its charred blades bent and its pale base drooping from the armor. A splattering of blood led to the other side of the room, where Lullaby lay crumpled and surrounded by more white coats. As they slowly peeled off Lullaby's deformed armor, her helmet was already off. Grotto stood by and ran his mouth. You need to tell me what happened, he said, shoving a white coat aside for a closer look. I don't get how she escaped. Just tell me. A white coat removed Lullaby's chest plate, and she gave a sigh of relief. Her hairs were a little burnt at the ends, but she seemed otherwise fine. You saw what happened. She ate through the inhibitor like it was nothing. No way, Grotto replied. Celestia herself could barely do that. Why don't you go tell her that? A white coat adjusted the tourniquet around the stump where her wing used to be, eliciting a pained hiss. And remind her how we couldn't even catch that bastard. I imagine the princess will be very interested in this flustercuck, boss. Yeah, I can barely wait to give my report. He scoffed. You must have put it on wrong. Did you hear it click? I patted a medic's side before pushing in front of him. Grotto. How many years have we been working together? 22, 3. You know we don't make this stuff up. I put the inhibitor on, and yes, it clicked. They pulled off Lullaby's fetlock plate. Yeah, she said, lay off. I heard the click too. I offered a hoof bump. I'm just glad you're fine. Apart from, well. She bumped my hoof with hers, wincing as we touched. Fine is a strong word. She turned back to Grotto. What happened, happened. Don't ask me how. Grotto opened his mouth to respond, but his helmet sounded with scarping. He pressed a hoof to the side of it and turned the other way. Yeah, we're on it. And tell those dimwits to scour the city for the unicorn. His helmet resounded with a click and the scraping stopped. The royal guard, he mumbled, more like the royal pain in my... Sir, said a white coat, gesturing at Lullaby. Shall we take her? Grotto rolled his eyes with a sigh, then stepped back and nodded. Yes, just move her already, get her out of here. They moved a stretcher closer and reached for Lullaby, only for her to shake them off. I'm okay, seriously, no need for that. She clambered to her hooves, only managing to take one step before falling over. Without trying to get up, she clenched her teeth and groaned. This time, she didn't object to being placed on the stretcher. As the coats took her away, I laid a hoof on her shoulder. "You stay strong now, big girl." She grinned. "When don't I?" Grotto opened his visor to rub his eyes. "What a mess," he grumbled. "Inhibitors always work. How didn't it work?" "Your guess is as good as mine," I said. "It's something we'll have to ask Nyx later. So what about the stallion?" "At least we got him. River was already escorting him outside when the explosion went off, and the royals were quick to get him afterwards." "It's not all bad, then." Grotto leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "He doesn't matter. Neither does Little Miss Roasted Flanks. Priestess Nyx was our big prize here, and we let her slip away." It didn't hurt when River chewed me out, I was used to that. Hearing Twilight Grotto say that we messed up, that I messed up, got to me, however. Tension built inside me until I could no longer contain it, and I released it in the form of a stomp that cracked the parquet. "Next time we see her," I said, "I'm shackling her myself." "I'll hold you to that." He turned around, whistling towards a royal guard who wore the most elaborate, and least practical, suit of armor. The captain of the bunch, I imagined. "You, come here." The captain was by no means a small stallion, yet he walked over with nervous steps, eyeing the cracked floor under my hoof. He stood at attention and saluted. "Why yes, sir." Grotto didn't return the formality, and I didn't feel like it either. "Doc's tending to the victims upstairs?" Grotto asked. "Yes, sir." "Good. Your royals are to make a thorough sweep. I trust they've been briefed on what to expect. Check for hidden rooms and crannies. Pull on every book, every candle, check every loose brick. And speaking of a thorough sweep..." He wrapped a leg around my shoulder, pulling me closer and knocking on my chest plate with the tip of a hoof. "He will stay here and watch. You don't get in his way, and you don't speak to him unless you're spoken to." He turned to whisper in my ear. "Make sure they don't miss anything." "Oh," I sighed, "why do I have to be the one?" "Because you let her run away," Grotto replied, smirking. "But mostly because I said so." I rolled my eyes. "Well, then." The captain had relaxed his pose by now, but jerked to attention when I turned to him. "Get me a scribe, then let's get started." When the foundations of Canterlot were laid some 20 years ago, the nobles protested. They had been restless since the banishment of Princess Luna, crying tyranny at every choice Princess Celestia made in her solitary rule. Canterlot was to become a symbol of renewal. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, so would Equestria grow great again after its darkest hour. The old city in the Everfree would be left as a memorial, a reminder of ages past, and a symbol of past sins forgiven but not forgotten. The memories of the longest night haunted us all, and few were the ponies who could stand another day in that accursed city. But oh, the nobles could never be pleased. The new city had been called a waste of resources, a frivolity at best, nothing but a testament to the hubris of Princess Celestia. At worst, Canterlot showed how little the princess cared for her little ponies, sacrificing Equestria's wealth on the altar of her own self-pity. She could not accept that she played any part in her sister's descent into madness, neither could she explain why she had stood idly by as Nightmare Moon ravaged the land. Canterlot was a distraction, for herself, and for the commoners. Or so the nobles said. It was not in my place to judge. None of that stopped the nobles from moving their families to the new city when Celestia commissioned her palace near the mountain's peak. Mansions and private villas soon cropped up to litter the mountainside. It wasn't long before they became theaters of conspiracy. Many were those who would have seen Princess Celestia dethroned. Haughty nobles hid their lust for power and wealth under a cloak of righteousness. Equestria could not possibly prosper under the rule of one supreme princess without a fellow diarch to keep her in line. These ponies were the first the Equestrian Bureau for State Security removed, or otherwise convinced to see things the princess way. Over the 2 decades since the longest night and the institution of the EBSS, the enemies of Equestria had grown clever, and none were as insidious as the children of the night. A common misconception about cultists is that they are fools. They are not. The truth about the children was far more frightening. They were ponies who were genuinely convinced that releasing Nightmare Moon from her prison would save the world. One wouldn't have known the mansion was a cultist base. It wasn't until one walked up the stairs that the truth began to crystallize. The royal guards knew their job, to document everything. Unicorns sat in every corner, sheets of paper floating around them as they sketched each room in astounding detail. My personal scribe was a young unicorn mare, straight out of school by the looks of it, a child by any standard. But she knew how to keep her mouth shut and to work her quill quickly, so I had no right to complain. Upstairs, tomes stood in tall stacks, scrolls filled with forbidden spells lined the shelves, and paintings of Nightmare Moon hung from the walls. The royal guards had already begun packing all of these, to be locked away in the cavernous vaults and forbidden wings of the Kenterlot archives. A string of disappearances had the EBSS scratching their collective heads for the better part of this last year. We had always suspected that the children might be behind it, but it was only through a few lucky breaks in the previous months that we had managed to track down the missing ponies, all the way to this residence. In the upstairs guest rooms, we found the victims of the cult. They lay on thin pillows of hay, dead or comatose through forbidden potions and magics. Skin hung loose from their weak bones and bedsores littered their undersides. Their stomachs and chests showed the marks of dissections stitched, torn, and stitched hastily together again. I even saw a few maggots festering in necrotic wounds, and oh, the smell of rot and bodily humors. Their magic-induced dreams were no escape for those still alive, if one considered this life at all. Their faces screwed up with fear and pain from some unseen terror, their legs twitching from time to time as though trying to run from their nightmares. My scribe kept it professional. Or at least she tried. I saw how rapidly she blinked and how little her eyes lingered on the victims, preferring instead to bury her gaze in her parchments as she documented the horrors she witnessed. The parchments floated close to her mouth, perhaps to cover her wavering lips. I envied her innocence. The worst part was that this by far wasn't the worst thing I had seen in my life. On the one hoof, now we had confirmation that Nyx was indeed real as opposed to a clever ploy to lead our investigation astray. On the other, our blunder tonight all but ensured we wouldn't be hearing from her anytime soon. I hated myself for not catching her. These poor souls deserved justice. The biggest room of the upper floor might have once been a lounge, it now served as a chapel devoted to Nightmare Moon. Thick curtains draped before the windows, keeping at bay the dim light of the oil lamps outside. Little passed in the way of furniture, crystal-engraved chandeliers shone upon the bare, red marble floor. A black carpet ran between rows of mats and pillows that lay scattered on the floor in place of pews, all the way to a dais and a pulpit upon it. As I approached the dais, my scribe scrambled to write everything down, ink spilling and papers crumpling in the air all around her. She even broke a quill or two, but she proved herself prepared, having brought spares. A tome lay open on the pulpit, bound in leather. The illustrations on the open pages explained a chilling ritual, the dissection of a pony's chest to remove and prepare the heart for purposes I had no desire to guess. If the description was to be believed, this magic would keep the heart beating, and the unfortunate victim alive, for hours even after the organ had been removed. Not that the tome wasn't interesting, but it could not hold my attention for long. An enormous fresco spread out on the wall behind the pulpit. Nightmare Moon stood triumphant over a defeated Celestia, her head surrounded by a halo of the brightly glowing moon. Although Celestia lay crumpled and bloody on the grassy hill, Nightmare Moon's hoof was extended towards her not in anger, but as an offer of help. As Celestia reached for her sister's hoof, even her expression was one of hope rather than fear. "The night is darkest before the dawn," read the large, ornate letters under the pair. Whoever had made this piece of art must have thought themselves profound. Clearly, they didn't know Nightmare Moon very well. It was a shame to see such talent wasted on insanity. I had to compliment the children on creating all this right under our noses, however. The EBSS was losing its touch. On a stone altar under the fresco lay a mare who had met an unfortunate end. Splintered ribs pierced through her collapsed chest, and a ceremonial knife stood wedged in her throat. The blood had barely dried. Beside the altar I saw shards of a shattered jar in a pool of some pungent, greenish liquid, and what I took to have been a heart trampled and splattered over it all. I recognized the blade lodged in the mare's throat as the one Nyx had thrown to her accomplice before they ran off in different directions. So the knife wasn't for self-defense at all, the stallion was meant to get rid of their sacrificial mare. By the looks of it, River had been too slow to stop him. Funny how he had forgotten to mention that little bit of trivia. I could not stop myself from turning to the gigantic depiction of Nightmare Moon again. The Nightmare Moon I had known would never have offered a hoof to Celestia, for she held only contempt for all the world. Although the artist didn't get her mannerisms right, I admired how lifelike the depiction was. I felt as though I was indeed standing in the terrifying mare's shadow. The more I looked, the more memories returned. Her perverse laughter echoing through the old city. Her teeth at my ears. Her tongue on my neck. Her madness in my mind. My heart raced, and a bead of sweat collected on my forehead.
Did you see her?
Turning, I saw my young scribe looking at me. At my stare, she shrunk away and turned her eyes to the floor.
I'm sorry.
She shook her head, then stood at attention.
I apologize, sir.
A fresh sheet of paper flew out of her bag, and she quickly put a quill to it, turning her attention to the fresco. By the way she bit her lower lip, I could tell how nervous she was.
Why does it matter?
I asked. Her quill stopped. She stared at it for a moment before looking up at me.
Well, it's just... I was.
She looked away for a moment, taking a deep breath.
I was about to when it happened, sir, and I... Call it by its name, the longest night.
The way kids treated the event never ceased to amuse me. She gulped.
I was so young when the longest night happened. And we lived quite far away from the old city, sir. We were lucky, the village was barely harmed.
I raised a brow.
What does that have to do with me? The way you looked at it, sir.
She poked a quill towards Nightmare Moon.
I ask with all due respect, and I'd understand if it isn't something you would wish to talk about, sir. Were you in the old city when it... I mean, when the longest night happened, sir? Is this how she looked?
I turned back towards the image of Nightmare Moon.
Have we checked every room?
I heard the sound of papers flying about.
Why yes, sir. I believe so, sir. I've been told there might be hidden I'll leave those to the rest of the royals.
Turning, I began walking out of the chapel.
A card should be waiting for me outside. I'll want your documents there. Yes, sir.
She quickly rolled up her papers and followed me.
And as for Nightmare Moon?
I stopped to look at her, and she froze under my stare.
The less you know about her, the better. Believe me.
With that, I continued walking. I didn't hear her move for another second or two.
Yes, sir,
she finally said. I didn't like how the raid on the mansion had gone. Yet as the card took me back to the headquarters, a smirk somehow found its way onto my lips. The owner of the mansion had been a thorn in the princess' side for quite a while, advising against her decisions and rallying other nobles to voice dissent as well. To add insult to injury, the old fool had come from a bloodline so diluted that he was noble on paper only. Princess Celestia had long been looking for an excuse to oust his family of bottom feeders from the Senate. It would seem her search had been in vain, for he had provided a reason on a silver platter. I was already imagining all the ways he'd protest. Certainly he didn't know about the massive cultist operation in his expensive yet conspicuously unused summer house, which lay just on the other side of the city from his even more luxurious home. I knew we could find proof if we wanted. I also knew we didn't have to. An old, frail stallion like him, a day spent in the interrogation room would loosen his tongue. And if it doesn't, well, he might find his granddaughter stripped of her noble rank entirely and banished from Canterlot due to certain information regarding her pastime activities coming to light. For ponies like him, I had no pity. Any pony who worked for the children of the night deserved punishment. As for the cultists themselves, we would first have to see if the mare would survive the night. At the same time, we would begin interrogation on her brother. We would capture Priestess Nyx and unravel her entire wretched cult once and for all. The cultists were not fools. Fools could not brew potions that kept their victims in perpetual nightmares. A fool could not have painted Nightmare Moon in all her horrifying glory. Fools could not have performed intricate surgeries to harvest the organs of live ponies. Thinking back to the cruelty I had witnessed in that mansion, my nose scrunched up with disgust. In my mind, I could find only one word to adequately describe the children of the night. Monsters. For your own benefit. Princess Celestia. To ponies today, I am the bastion of harmony, the bringer of light and peace, the one good, great Princess Celestia. Countless generations have praised me and poured my name into song and prayer, and I have grown used to it. But once upon a time, my little ponies did not see me this way. There was a time when I did not deserve the praise, a time of which I am most ashamed, one that I've buried under 1,000 years worth of lies. When I was little, Star Swirl the Bearded once told me that one's character is determined not by meticulously planned actions, but by those taken hastily in times of crisis. I have learned, by now, the chess game of fate. I learned because I had to. I would not be alive if I did not know how to bend the lives and futures of mortal ponies. When you have the opportunity to see the ramifications of your actions across the centuries, when you start to behold the intertwining streams of myriad little destinies, only then do you realize the power of even one solitary sentence. I have witnessed the rise of bloodlines with the birth of first sons and seen them perish with the death of the last, and no pony ever knew that it had been the subtle touch of my hoof that guided and twisted their paths. I know that fate had bestowed upon me this life so I could toil for the good of all of us, and the good of all who would come in the millennia ahead. There was a time long ago when I was careless, and I paid the price with that which I held most dear. I lost Equestria's innocence, and with it, my own. I have only seen one monster in my life, and her name was Nightmare Moon. The heart of Princess Luna, my dear sister, had long been consumed by the nightmare. She fought bravely, valiantly, but Nightmare Moon was not a foe she could defeat alone. When she called out to me in desperation, I dismissed her concerns, unable to recognize what was at stake. A humbling lesson in the nature of pride. The longest night is a testament to my failure as a sister when Luna needed me the most. For 2 weeks, Nightmare Moon laid waste to Equestria. Born of hate and mired in jealousy, she cared for nothing but to bring about the death of her world. Corpses and ash followed in her wake. For 2 weeks, I stood by and watched. I denied what I saw with my very eyes. I refused to admit that my sweet sister would turn away from me. For 2 weeks I pleaded, I begged, I grovelled, and I threatened, and when she spat in my face, I watched. When I could watch no longer, the elements of harmony put an end to the turmoil in a flash of light. As my little ponies mourned for the lost, they cursed the heavens, and with them, they cursed my dear sister. Yet there was nothing and no pony they cursed as they cursed me. After Nightmare Moon, my magical powers turned from an inspiration into a clear and present threat to all that lived. After the longest night, I had proven myself incapable of rule. For years, the only time any pony looked me in the eye was to hurl abuse and contempt. Gone were the smiles, gone were the praise and the songs and the prayers. My little ponies changed, and I changed in kind. The guilt became too heavy to bear. I broke under its weight. I became ruthless, harsh, even cruel, a mirror to reflect the world in the longest night's wake. I made a promise to myself and to the mare in the moon, I would drag Equestria by the mane from the ashes of the longest night, and I would do it if she kicked and screamed in protest. The decades that followed the longest night were the hardest, for all of Equestria, and for me. I walked on the razor's edge, one slip and I might have become a nightmare worse than my sister. In my darkest days, it was the story of 2 little ponies that would help me see the light. It was, perhaps, because of Swift Sweep, and a young mare named New Page, that I did not become a monster myself. New Page. I've always been a night pony. The half-built spire of the palace loomed above the city, its long shadow splitting the light of the moon overhead. The spire stood dressed in a suit of scaffolding and rickety walkways, bustling with workers and booming with the sounds of construction during the day, and an abandoned maze of metal bars and wooden boards at night. 100 and more little nooks and crannies for the sly visitor. High in the tower, a royal guard perched atop a pillar that yet supported no ceiling. From his teeth hung a heavy lantern aglow with burning oil, and his eyes glistened in the light as they scanned the streets below. When his head turned my way, I hid in the shadows of a great stone window frame. This wasn't the first time I've been here when I shouldn't have, and I did not expect it to be the last. I readied myself for a swift flight upwards, waiting for the moment the guard turned the other way. An explosion roared across Canterlot, giving me a jump. The scaffolds all around me resonated with the blast, and all the different sections of it pattered and clattered against one another. After a moment of fright, I managed to collect myself. Above, the royal guard stood on 3 legs, one raised in suspense and head stuck forwards, ears turned towards a distant street. Amidst the quiet mansions lining the mountainside whose windows bore no light, one building stood lit by the unmistakable lights of dancing flames. Another royal guard whisked past the moon, banking for the burning home in the distance. A second later, the sky came alive as a swarm of guards rose from the walls of the palace and the alleyways of the city, each descending on the same point far away. The guard on the perch spread his wings, and with a jump and a flap, he was off too. Although I had no clue what caused the blast, and hoped that no pony was hurt, I thanked the powers that be for the timing. Not many guards remained at their posts near the spire, and even they had their attention directed towards the action in the distance. Lifting a hoof, I looked into the bauble bracelet around my fetlock. A dark, dim image of myself reflected back, giving me a reassuring look. The bracelet had been a gift and a good luck charm from my mother when I was little. Well, Mama, it's time to see if it still works. After adjusting my saddlebag for a tighter fit, I too unfurled my wings and jumped. I kept close to the spire as I approached the top, staying inside the labyrinth of scaffolds and suspensions. I never liked to stay in the air for long, instead I made fast swoops from board to board, pausing at each stop to look for spying eyes. As I came around the spire in a glide, I saw a guard turn his head my way. With one powerful flap on my wings, I forced myself to stop and twisted my path the other way to quickly disappear behind the wall. My heart began to race as I heard the wings of the guard behind me. I took a sharp left, then broke into a quick dive to grab onto the underside of the scaffold a level below. From there I watched as the guard flew high, squinting his eyes and craning his neck this way and that. With a final shrug, he turned around and returned to his post. I let go of the scaffold and shot straight up, spending less than a second in plain sight before flying through a window on the spire's highest floor. There would yet be several more levels to this tower before it was finished. For now, the only ceiling this floor had was a crude blanket of plain cloth held up by iron bars to protect the unplastered walls from unscheduled rain or heavy wind. Tonight, this room would be my point of entry. All that stood between me and the stairwell was a simple wooden door and a rusty iron lock, to be replaced, doubtlessly, once they began furnishing the insides of the spire. As I took a few steps back, readying to ram the door, the mare in the moon eyed me through a small tear in the tarp above. It felt strange to think that to any pony older than me, the mare in the moon was a peculiarity. For thousands of years the moon had been bare, but I had never known any other moon. The mare in the moon had always watched me snoop around in the night, and I found myself taking a liking to her. She never told any pony. A small cloud passed before her eye as though she had just winked. I sent back a wink of my own and a playful grin, just because. I rushed the door, slamming my shoulder into it, and the frame broke at the lock. It only needed a few more determined bucks for the lock to fall and the door to creak open. The pain in my shoulder hit me when I passed through. I dropped to my rump and set my back against the door.
Oh, stars!
I hissed through clenched teeth and rubbed my shoulder.
Gosh!
I circled my shoulder around and listened for the pleasing pops. Next time I should just steal a key. But I did it, I figured. I may have been but a girl from the outside, but I still had some fight in me. I paid attention not to put too much weight on that leg as I stood up. I must have been a dozen or two floors above ground. Going down I didn't mind much, it was the return trip that bothered me. I didn't come to infiltrate Canterlot Palace, see. Not that there was much to see here yet, much of the building stood entirely vacant and unfurnished, waiting for the facades to be finished first. Only the bottom few floors were finished, starting with the Princess Suite. I knew there were many treasures to be had there, century-old urns and paintings, rooms where even the curtains were gilded with gold, but I wasn't here for such riches. I came looking for a different kind of prize, the kind that I, and the pony, who convinced me to do this in the first place, personally valued the most. I was after knowledge. Not that I was a professional thief stealing for rich clients across the country, though I fancied the thought, neither was I some kind of avenger or bringer of justice that stole from the rich to feed the poor, although sometimes I did fantasize. No, it was just an old friend asking for favors. She had the means to get in, and I had the ability, so we struck a deal. It took a few minutes to reach the base of the spire. The way down had been uneventful, no guards, no nothing. The tricky part was still ahead, with all the lovely patrols I knew I had run across. Over my previous visits, I had come to learn that most of them were concentrated towards Celestia's suite and the treasury, thinning out in other places. That was good. Just as I stepped out of the stairwell into the lavish foyer of the palace, I heard the rattling of armor, making me slink right back. A pair of royal guards, one unicorn and one Pegasus, walked lazily by. The spear of the unicorn floated beside its owner, while the Pegasus used his as a walking stick, knocking it against the floor with every step as the two discussed something about mares. What I liked about the royal guards was that even when they kept their mouths shut, they could still be heard coming a mile away. Once the duo disappeared behind a corner towards the treasury, I hurried off in the opposite direction. The wide halls of the palace offered only a precious few opportunities to hide to the unwelcome visitor, and the light of the moon poured through the tall windows that connected the marble floor to the ornate ceiling. Progress could never be quick, go too fast, and the sound of your hooves will give you away, but go too slowly and you'll surely be caught by the next patrol. It was a fine line, one I've learned to tread with careful steps. Passing under the archway that connected the foyer to the next room, I heard another patrol on its way. I narrowly avoided being spotted by ducking under a stairway that led to an overlooking balcony. One turn to the left took me to the servants' residence. Unlike the hallways of the palace, this section was small, its halls tiny, narrow, and windowless. Though candlesticks adorned the walls between the rooms of Celestia's many servants, maids, cooks, butlers, what have you, none of them were lit, leaving me reliant on the little light that seeped in from either end of the hallway. My eyes quickly adjusted to the near pitch blackness. Mama always told me I'd ruin them by reading at night all the time. Well look, Mama, I didn't. Another thing about the servants' quarter was that Celestia appeared to trust them entirely. No patrols. So long as none of them got up to have a tinkle, and I kept the clopping of my hoofs quiet, I could pass right by. I liked this section the most, calm and homely, really, and cheap carpets covered the floors to reduce the clopping of your steps. Ah, but I couldn't stay here. Maybe one day I'd get a job at the archives, I thought, then I could perhaps land a room in the palace. Would have been a lot more comfortable than my current rat hole. Another turn left, and a short pace down a corridor on the right. I was halfway through when I heard the sounds of heavy, armored steps. Looking back, I saw rays of light creep along the floor of the servants' quarter, and a unicorn stepping around the corner. I had to give it to Celestia, that was new. All I could do was take off running. This corridor led directly into the archives, and that's where I was headed. Emerging there, I found myself once again in a wide, well-lit space. I kicked off from the ground and flew up above the doorway, into the slim shadow where a pillar met the ceiling. Breath held, I waited. The unicorn emerged beneath me shortly, with an orb of magical light floating beside him. I'd learned to hover in complete silence back when I was a little, even before I even learned to read, a skill I used many times to prank Mama. She'd think I was gone, freak out, then bam, surprise snuggles. I was that kind of kid. The unicorn stopped and flashed his horn. The orb of light bolted off, making a quick lap around the archive's anteroom, pausing briefly in front of each long hallway that led to a different wing. As I slunk further behind the pillar, the orb's light briefly caught the tip of my hoof. The unicorn looked up, and thought I felt my heart stop beating for just a second. The guard perked his ears and squinted. I pressed myself against the other side of the pillar and grabbed on, pulling my wings in. I couldn't see him, but I heard him walk around. It took all I had in me to painstakingly crawl around the pillar to keep out of sight. Whenever I felt my hoofs slip, I grabbed on harder. I could feel the stone grind against my very bones. The guard stopped again. After a moment, the orb of light descended back to him and he retreated into the corridor he had come from. I'd have given a sigh of relief, had I not ran out of breath after holding it for so long. Oh, that sweet taste of air. I stretched my legs and took a moment to gather my thoughts. The Canterlot archives were a maze of stairs and twisting hallways, patrolled only scantily by the guards. I knew to avoid the better protected areas. My destination was the Lunar Wing, the one named in honor of the banished princess of the night that held knowledge which Celestia deigned to spare from us simple mortals. One had to wonder why she wanted to have the memory of her sister buried. Still, I was grateful that the books my friend wanted to borrow were in the Lunar Wing as opposed to a better guarded one. It was locked, to be sure, but I had ways. From the entrance of the public university wing, you could just see the Lunar Wing's enchanted gates around the bend. I had sneaked a few peeks during my long hours spent studying in the archives, not too much of course, because the guards didn't like it when ponies looked. On the path I took across the place, I'd have to pass before the star swirl the bearded wing first. Now that one was a tough nut. Rumors had it that the wing contained spells that tampered with the very fabric of reality and the nature of life itself, and that the entire wing had been constructed as a sort of conduit between worlds. There were who knows how many spells sealing it off from the outside world, not to mention the platoon of guards that patrolled the halls that led to it every hour of the day. I may have been good, but not good enough to get in the star swirl the bearded wing. No use philosophizing, I had classes for that. Best get going. Thick curtains draped over the archive's great windows, and in the light that crept in between them, the mare in the moon watched me run. Ever silent, never judging. Hiding behind a curtain or taking a quick turn down another corridor was enough to get past the occasional guard, and I had to do a roll mid-air to get past the guards before the gates of the star swirl the bearded wing. Apart from those little bumps in the road, traversing the archives wasn't particularly difficult. I liked to think that I was just that good. It took but a few minutes to reach the tall gate of the lunar wing. Close to its surface, I could hear the air vibrate and whistle, making the hairs on my muzzle stand on end, the magics that held the gate shut resonating in an invisible aura. A quick look to the right, a peek to the left, the coast was clear, no sounds of rattling armor to be heard. I threw my saddlebag down to quickly dive into it. Books filled most of the space inside, blank, all of them. At the bottom I finally found the thing I needed, the picklock ruby. Picking it up, I hefted it in my hoof. It was heavier than it looked. Not my creation, of course. I was a history student, not a spell crafter. My friend usually supplied me with all the things I needed to get in and out of the archives. Did she make them? Well, I never took her to be a magical prodigy. But I didn't know, and I didn't care. I didn't pretend to understand how enchanted gemstones worked. All I needed was to know how to use it. I placed the ruby against the keyhole, then took my hoof away. The ruby remained in the air. Tendrils of red light sprouted from the gem, creeping into the hole and boring into the gate itself. This was the deal, Flora Dawn provided the means to access the library, and I would sneak in to lift a few books for her. In return, I'd get to keep a few of them. We worked with the mutual agreement that neither of us asked questions. It was safer that way, for both of us. As the gem worked on the lock, I looked around again. Still no pony. The light of the gem gave out, letting it fall. I caught it before it could clatter on the floor. A shimmering wave washed outwards from the keyhole over the gate's surface, then back in before dissipating entirely. The whistling in the air stopped. Confirming that there was still no pony watching me, I quickly got inside, easing the gate gently back into its frame as I shut it behind myself. By the time I took my second step away, the whistling started again. Why would a young pony, such as I risk the dungeons, banishment, or worse for a few books? I wasn't sure myself. On the one hoof, I was confident in my abilities not to be caught. Frankly, I found myself enjoying the thrills of doing something I shouldn't. On the other hoof, the longest night had always fascinated me. I could have no memories of it, having been born just a week or two before it, but I had a burning desire to find out more. So this was it, the great lunar wing, home to knowledge that Celestia would have buried. If she didn't want any pony to see, perhaps she should have buried it all indeed. From my saddlebag, I fished out a piece of paper, a list of books that Flora wanted on this run. She had listed some by title, others by author, others merely by topic, whatever relevant I could get my hooves on, she said, would do. We were careful not to lift too many books per occasion, so as not to draw attention. The later they figured out the books were missing, if at all, the better it was for us. The blank tomes in my saddlebag served to aid that deception, I had used them to replace what I took so as to make the theft less glaring. From the first level, I took Star Swirl's Soul Link, a study of Luna's fractured spirit. From the balcony overlooking the rest of the wing, I lifted Memoirs in the Night. A brief collection of stories from not long before the longest night, signed by one Silhouette. Next, I'd have to find a book on the creation of the Night Guards, if indeed such a thing existed. Anything I could find, a single passage in a grimoire, a spell scroll, would be enough. Best start looking, I figured, in the spell crafting section. That was on the ground floor and just around a corner. I hopped onto the balcony rails and unfurled my wings, readying to quickly glide to the lower floor. The rattling of armor. My heart skipped a beat as I snapped my head towards the gate. Hoof steps, many of them. The gate's magic swirled, winking in and out. They were unlocking the gate. But I hadn't been followed. How did they? A wave of magic washed over the gate. I leapt from the balcony, slamming a shoulder into the bookshelf standing nearest the gate. Didn't care for the pain. If I didn't walk right for a few days, that'd be a small price to pay for not getting caught. The shelf tipped over, books flying everywhere, and slammed into the gate. As the final spell lock evaporated and the guards outside tried to pour inside, they found the gate barricaded by the shelf. But that means I couldn't get out either. Okay, keep calm, I told myself. And stop chewing your lips, ponies ask questions. I'd always told myself this wouldn't happen. I was just that good, after all. The guards banged on the gate, but the bookshelf was too heavy to budge. Okay, cool it. I flicked my mane behind my back and rubbed the sides of my head. Flora made sure I came prepared. The ceiling held a memory of Princess Luna. 2 stories up, a stained glass window portrayed the princess of the night curled up in peaceful slumber within the moon. Beautiful it may have been, but it was also a serious security flaw. To make sure no pony got into the lunar wing by breaking the window, they had barred it with steel, from the inside, weirdly enough. Perhaps Celestia wanted her sister to have a good view of the window from the heavens. From my view, it became a poetic picture, in a way, of Luna sleeping behind prison bars. As the guards banged on the gate, yelling for me to come out and for their peers to move, move, move. I didn't know how long the barricade would hold, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. Reaching into my saddlebag with a hoof, I flew up to the stained glass window and took out another red gemstone. This gem had a groove carved into its cylindrical shape to fit snugly onto the window's bars. I knocked a hoof on the gemstone's side and slipped it onto the middle bar. The banging on the gate continued, and I saw unicorn magic creep across its surface. As my hoof pressed the gemstone onto the bar above, I felt the gem radiate heat, glowing brighter every second. Unicorn auras permeated the gate and crept slowly onto the bookshelf. The bar seethed red at the touch of the gemstone. Come on, come on. There was a loud bang, making me flinch and drop the gem. Diving after it, I saw magic blast the bookshelf away from the gate. It slid away and rocked in place, nearly tipping over the other way before settling upright. I reached for the falling ruby, but my hoof only knocked it away. It clattered on the ground, splitting at the side, red glow seethed from the crack. When I tried to pick it up, it burned my hoof. The gate began to creak open. I flew up to the side of the bookshelf and bucked it, sending it falling back onto the gate. As I burst up to the window, I found the bar already cold but deformed. Without thinking, I flipped my belly up, wrapping my forehooves around the deformed bar and setting my hindhooves against the others around it. I pulled downward with all my might, grunting, screaming through clenched teeth. I beat my wings with everything I had for leverage against the bar. My legs burned and my bones felt like they were going to break. Just when I thought my muscles would rip, the bar broke in two, bending under the pressure of my hooves. Magic again swelled around the gate, and the banging continued. I began banging on the bent bar, hammering it with both hooves in a desperate frenzy to create an opening. My eyes began to tear up from the pain, and my lungs choked out an involuntary grunt every time my hoof impacted the metal. Little by little, hit by hit, the bar bent. Once there was just enough space for me to crawl through, I turned and bucked the stained window, right at Luna's heart. As I shielded my face, I heard the glass shatter. The entire window came down around me, starting from the center, showering the room with colorful shards. As I climbed through the narrow space between the bent bar and the next, I heard the bookshelf fall over and the gate open. There were few guards outside, they must have been called away to investigate the explosion earlier that night. Good for me. With one quick glance back, I saw one Pegasus flying for me. I turned and shot away, too quick for the armored guard to follow, and disappeared behind Canterlot Palace. I darted through the scaffolds and walkways, hitting my wing on suspensions and unchiseled outcrops, but I didn't care. My heart beat in my throat. I never knew I could fly so fast. I turned here, I dove there, I whisked in whatever direction my eyes first saw, never looking back and refusing to slow down. Finally my wings gave out, and I crashed somewhere near the park in the branches of a tall tree. I curled onto a branch and breathed shallow breaths, struggling to keep from throwing up. I paid no attention to the burning in my lungs. After a minute, my heart finally calmed, and my mind cleared. Perching on the branch, I looked around from the relative safety of the dense foliage and found no pursuers. With a quick check on my fetlock, I found Mama's bracelet safe and sound around my leg.
You did well,
I whispered.
Really well.
Then I realized I couldn't feel my saddlebag. I jumped up, stomach clenching and panic washing over me like a cold shower, only to see the bag hanging by a strap from a broken branch above. With a sigh of relief, I looked at the bracelet again.
You cheeky little thing.
I lifted the bag off the branch and leaned my back at the trunk of the tree, taking the bag into my lap. Though I didn't get to use most of the blank tomes, at least both of the books I had taken were inside. So that's something. I looked around again, and found everything clear. It took me a second to process it. I'd done it. I got away. As I hugged my bag like it was my baby, I caught myself giggling. I cut it short by stuffing a hoof in my mouth. Let's not alarm the guards, I figured. I did it. Though I didn't think I'd be going back to the archives anytime soon. Not at night, anyway. Throwing the bag over my back, I carefully hopped down from the tree before running home. It wasn't illegal to walk around Canterlot, after all. I kept my head down, of course, and made sure to take only roads without streetlights for good measure. My Canterlot home was a small apartment among many towards the southern end of the city. Little more than a hole dug into the rocks of the mountain, really, but I was glad to have my scholarship cover this much. Celestia wasn't very popular, not that any pony would have said this out loud, but for my part, I liked her. For her reforms in education, if nothing else. But of course, it was just her way of pushing lies onto the ignorant public and training a new generation of brainwashed youth, if the frustrated mutterings of old ponies were to be believed. From the little porch of my apartment, I took one last look at the unfinished spire of the palace, and the little black dots that were the guards swirling around it in the moonlight. So long, boys. I kicked my door shut and stumbled into my room. A quick flick of my hoof sent the bag sliding under the bed. I finally took off my bracelet, one again thanking it for its powers of good fortune, and placed it in the drawer of my desk. Surely I had exhausted its magic by now, best let the poor thing rest. I butted the drawer in, then collapsed into bed. The lecture hall slowly filled up as students drifted in, one by one. Well, filled would be putting it strongly. Not many ponies in Equestria got to study at the University of Canterlot, and even fewer chose to study the field I did. Unicorn nobles would most often shove their children into spellcrafting, the most privileged might get to study under Star Swirl himself, while others chose to pursue rhetoric or geometry and astronomy. These were by far the most lucrative fields. I dabbled in astronomy myself, just as a hobby, my main interests lay elsewhere. For a common pony, like me who relied on the scholarship afforded by the treasury, studying history was unheard of. I liked to think of myself as some sort of pioneer. I was the youngest of our small group, and last night's little excursion didn't stop me from being the first one to arrive to class. Again. In a strange symmetry, the oldest of us, some 7 years or so older than me, would always arrive fifth and last. Right on cue, the gates of the lecture hall burst open behind me. I didn't have to turn to know who had just arrived. Storming Falls was a brash Pegasus, and a disgrace to Commander Hurricane's bloodline. I wouldn't have been surprised to find out I knew more about her than he did. He threw himself into his usual place at the desk behind me and mumbled his greetings.
Hey.
His breath smelled of a night drowned in expensive wine and cheap mares. From the way he'd eye me, I always thought he fancied me. I threw a quick good morning his way before turning forward again. Mama would have killed me for brushing off a noble stallion like that, but in all honesty, he creeped me out. Storming poked my wing.
You hear that explosion last night?
I shuddered at his touch.
Who didn't? It was on High Street, he said, leaning closer. A cousin lives there. Said it was an EBSS raid gone wrong. Said he saw bodies, a lot of 'em.
I looked him dead in the eye. That made him shrink back.
If the EBSS is involved, it's best we don't talk about it, don't you think? If it concerns the rest of us, I'm sure the princess will make an announcement at the plaza. So the EBSS can just blow up our homes.
He scoffed loudly, gurgling then spitting.
You don't think that's wrong? I swear, if we got to make decisions again, like back in Hurricane's time.
No, I said, pushing back his forehead.
Nope, not listening.
With that, I turned around. Ponies who said such things had a habit of disappearing. Though for storming here, I felt it would have been good riddance.
All's I'm saying is...
Hoof steps. A face I didn't recognize had entered the hall and made his way between the rows of desks. His horn glowed in greenish light, and a stack of books floated right beside him, following the bobbing of his head. And that must be our new professor. The previous one suddenly had to leave because of family reasons. Not my business what that entailed. I mentally thanked this one for shutting storming up. As he reached the front desk, the light of the professor's horn winked out, dropping the stack of books down. He took off his monocle and briefly brushed it against his vest before putting it back on. Straightening his back, he stood at attention, overlooking us with a high chin and lips sealed stiff. I was the first to pick up on the gesture. Gently pushing my chair out, making sure not to make much noise, I got up from my seat and stood at attention as well. With my chin raised, I came level with the professor despite him standing on a raised dais. He was a small, aging stallion, and me, well, I had always been a little big. Although I didn't turn to check, I heard the squeaking of chairs as more and more students got the hint, standing up one by one. When the sounds stopped, I saw the corners of the professor's lips curl to a smile. After a moment spent scanning the class, he breathed out. Then he relaxed his posture and waved a hoof downwards.
You may sit down.
In another bout of chair squeaks and added whispers, we took our seats again. He turned to me.
What is the name of the fine young lady?
I perked up as I clopped my hoofs together.
New page, sir.
Storming poked my wing again and snickered.
Nerd.
The professor sent him a glance, his faint smile growing subtly.
I take it the lady has a reputation.
A wave of guilty, quiet giggles washed over the group. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help a smile myself. The professor cleared his throat and let his smile fade away.
I suppose this greeting has fallen out of style, hasn't it? I consider myself a rather old-fashioned stallion. I like to begin lectures this way. Humor an old fool.
He stepped behind his desk and took the top book off the stack to flick it open.
Can any pony guess when this style of formal greeting began becoming less popular?
The class answered with hushed murmurs, no pony speaking up. Rarely did they teach etiquette during history lessons. I knew that my tutor back home had me stand at attention before we'd begin, and he was also quite an old pony, and Hortsmouth was an ancient town anyway. Barely any children there, just old ponies. But in the Canterlot University, I really didn't know about any customs, and...
The longest night?
Asked Storming. By the tone, it was more of a guess than anything. The whispers stopped, and silence befell the hall.
Yes,
the professor replied. His voice was matter of fact, showing no hint of aversion at the mention of that terrible event.
In many ways, society before the longest night was much more, shall we say, rigid than it is today. I suppose it was that night which made us appreciate each other a little more. Happy to be alive and to have each other, as it were.
He stopped for a moment.
What's with the faces?
His brows furrowed as his eyes scanned us.
Oh. That's right. You're that generation. It's taboo, isn't it? You're the kids born right around that time. You don't remember.
I saw the hint of a subdued smile on his lips again, just for a moment before it dissolved.
Well, he said, if you happen to have been born, or conceived really, shortly before the longest night and you're still around, congratulations. You're lucky. Nightmare Moon didn't like children very much.
He leaned forward, lowering his voice.
Afraid of the dark.
He stood quiet for a moment. We just stared. I couldn't guess what he was going for with this. When he spoke again, his voice sounded deeper, and it boomed throughout the hall.
Forgive me, I have not introduced myself. I am Golden Monocle, and as you've most likely guessed, I will be the one to teach you about the longest night. But first you have to learn to talk about it.
He inhaled deeply, and his voice softened again.
How do you want to learn about history if you're afraid of it?
Pursing his lips, he shook his head. He dropped into his chair, which creaked as he leaned back. With his hooves on his belly, he went on.
I like to make my first lecture very talky. You might call it wasted time, but I like gauging just how much you kids actually care. When was the longest night?
I put up a hoof. Golden Monocle nodded.
On the night before the longest day of the year, which would later become the Summer Sun Celebration. Which means the 20th anniversary is coming up.
The professor looked me over, raising a brow.
How long was the longest night? 2 weeks, 3 days, and a little.
I rubbed the side of my head.
5 hours.
A suppressed groan resounded behind me. I paid Storming no mind, and neither did the professor. He shrugged.
Well, if you say it was 5 hours, it was 5 hours. I certainly wasn't counting.
He sighed.
Maybe we're rushing ahead of ourselves there. Let's back up. A little more personal, less academic. You don't have to answer this one. You usually don't. But I always ask.
He leaned forward, putting his hooves onto the desk and taking a moment to look each of us in the eye.
Has any of you lost any pony in the longest night?
When our eyes met, I cast my gaze down. Didn't even mean to do that. He was right, though, I didn't want to answer it. Lost my papa. Mama would sing odes about him, though I had never known him. He was a royal guard who died bravely defending Mama and me from a pair of berserk night guards. That's why Mama moved all the way out to Hortsmouth to raise me, she said, because she couldn't bear to live near the old city anymore. It was a miracle I even happened before, well.
As I thought,
Golden Monocle said.
I'm good at recognizing the faces. Don't worry, your secrets are safe with me.
He rubbed his chin.
Well then, tell me about the tyranny clause.
Oh, I knew that one, and I much preferred fishing facts and trivia from my memory over thinking about Papa.
Normally,
I said,
a majority vote from the Senate had the power to veto the decisions of Princess Luna and Princess Celestia. The tyranny clause could be evoked in case of an unforeseen catastrophe, such as war or supernatural disaster, to give the two sisters supreme executive power. This would be the tyranny of the two sisters, and lasted 1 year.
I couldn't keep a straight face. No matter how much I protested, my lips curled to a smile.
Princess Celestia evoked the clause during the longest night and has subsequently elected to extend its duration every year. Today, the Senate fills an advisory role. And the princess listens, of course.
The professor raised a brow.
What were the night guards? Princess Luna's personal guard, later banished by the elements of harmony. Once ordinary ponies, they were bound to her through magic as the ultimate sign of loyalty or penance, giving them a bat-like appearance. And?
He asked. I needed a second.
This has also made them infertile.
He nodded, narrowing his eyes.
Not exactly what I was looking for.
I swallowed.
Well, there were a couple hundred of them at any given time, spread throughout the old city and related settlements. During the Princess Luna-Princess Celestia feud, that is the rise of Nightmare Moon, that is the longest night, they turned on Celestia and her royal guard. They.
The professor stomped a hoof on the desk, the bang resounding across the hall.
Monsters,
he said.
You will never find a whore more fickle than history. She will spread her legs to any pony powerful enough. But if there is one thing that you can always be absolutely certain of, it's that the night guards were monsters.
He looked down and licked his lips, shaking his head quickly. With a deep breath, he got up from his chair and faced us. He didn't seem so tiny anymore.
Even before the longest night, many ponies were against the night guard system, if you were to call it that. Placing public safety in the hoofs of vandals and wannabe soldiers.
He scoffed.
They used alicorn magic to bypass years of mental and physical training. Needless to say, Princess Luna was relentlessly attacked for running the institution. And when the inevitable happened, it was too late.
Behind the professor's eyes, I saw fire burn. To me, the longest night had always been just like any other page in the book, history, nothing more. Consciously, I had known it all along, but this was when it dawned on me, Professor Golden Monocle was some pony who had seen the atrocities that my mama refused to talk about. And suddenly, I felt ashamed for treating the event so nonchalantly. I couldn't look him in the eye.
I want to drill this into your heads as early as possible, he went on, shaking his hoof in the air. Do not feel sorry for the night guards. Monsters, all of them. Let no pony tell you otherwise.
He shrugged, a hint of a smile again appearing on his lips yet again.
Not that any pony would.
Even after the professor finally calmed down and continued the lecture, I couldn't help but wonder what he might have seen. It was late afternoon by the time my last class was done. Fishing my key from my bag, I slid it into the lock, only to have the apartment door creak open at the first push. My heart skipped a beat. I looked back, at the long sloped path that snaked along the mountainside from the streets below. No pony nearby. Turning back to the door, I took a deep breath and pushed in slowly, trying not to make a sound. The anteroom was empty.
Paige,
called a familiar voice. I exhaled in relief. I closed the door with a hind hoof.
Flora, where are you?
In response, I heard the sounds of water splashing. Turning into my room, I threw my bag onto the bed and looked to where the sound came from.
What are you doing in my bathroom?
More splashing.
Indoor plumbing, Paige. Indoor plumbing.
As I opened the bathroom door, a gust of hot air and steam blasted me. Flora Dawn lay submerged in the tub with only her eyes and muzzle above the water. A dirty cloak lay crumpled in the laundry basket. She quickly looked me over before closing her eyes.
You've got warm water flowing from the wall. Remember how back in Hortsmouth we had to fill the tub from the well halfway down the mountain? And even then it was cold.
She leaned back, and with a comfortable smile sunk her head under the surface so that only her ears and horn poked out. Then she started blowing bubbles.
Well, maybe if you pursued an education like I did instead of running away for 10 years, maybe Celestia would pay for your luxurious Canterlot home.
She sat up with a jerk, splashing warm water all over me. She stretched her hooves and shook her light red mane dry. Her coat was even lighter, almost entirely white with just the faintest shade of pink. Back when we were kids, we used to joke that she was an albino.
So,
she began as she draped her wet legs over the side of the tub.
Did you do the thing? No, I go first. Don't you ever take that thing off.
I pointed at the amulet around her neck.
I mean, I know I have my quirks, but really.
Flora curled her neck to look down at her amulet. It was shaped like a downward-pointing triangle that curved slightly to follow the lines of her neck, a dark, metallic plate polished to a brilliant shine, with an embedded, deep red gemstone adorning the center.
It was a gift from some pony I admire. Of course I don't. Now, about the books. No, let me go second too. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that explosion last night, would you?
Flora raised a brow above a sly grin.
Even if I did, you wouldn't want me to tell you.
I conceded defeat with a sigh.
All right. Yes, I got the books. Well, some of them. Damn well got caught too, I actually had to use they. Which ones?
Flora leapt from the tub and shoved me aside as she burst into my room.
Hey, at least dry yourself up, will you?
I got a towel and, following her into the room, threw it on her shoulders.
Under the bed.
Quick as she was to climb under the bed, I grabbed her tail and pulled her out.
Don't get them wet, you.
I pulled the towel over her head and eyes.
Towel. Use it.
While she dried her mane, I reached under the bed and pulled my worn saddlebag out. I undid its latch to spill the contents onto the bed.
So, as you can see,
I explained as I sorted through the contents,
most of these are the blanks. I only got 2 out, this and this here. Oh, here's the door gem. Lost the heat one.
Flora wrapped the towel around her neck like a scarf.
Wait, they didn't see you, did they? I wouldn't be here if they did, would I?
She clapped a hoof on my shoulder.
And that's why you're the best.
She reached for the stolen books.
So which ones are these? The Soul Link one, and the memoirs.
As Flora looked them over, I had to resist the urge to take them out of her hooves.
So, when am I getting these?
She cracked open Soul Link, and responded without looking up.
Oh, well, that all depends. These are very, very interesting pieces.
I pursed my lips.
Well, what about payment for last time? Are you done with those yet? Patience, my dear.
The tip of her horn sparkled and a red tuft of magic turned the page. She patted my head with her gaze still in the book.
I should have something for you by next week. I think this is the right time to mention that I'm not going back.
Her magic winked out and the book fell. She turned to me with an incredulous expression.
Why not? Because I came this close to getting caught, hello.
Sitting back, I crossed my hooves.
I know I do crazy things, but no more. I think I've finally had enough excitement, and I don't want those EBSS monsters knocking on my door.
Flora looked away for a moment. Her expression changed from jovial to serious, not something I saw often.
Very well,
she said.
That's reasonable. Tell you what.
She threw Soul Link onto the bed, then went to pick up memoirs, only to theatrically give it over to me.
You keep this one for the time being. You've definitely earned it.
Raising a brow, I took the book. Better do it, I figured, before she changed her mind.
As for not going back to the archives, I understand that.
She rubbed her chin.
If you used the heat gem, that means you made quite the scene. Has to be swarming with guards. Not a safe place, no.
She leaned a bit closer, a sly smile spreading across her face.
I'm sure we can come up with something different. And mutually beneficial,
I added.
Of course,
she replied.
Make no mistake, you are very important to us. And we take care of those we hold important. That ominous we again, Flora. Yes, well.
Flora giggled.
Not knowing is, trust me, for your own benefit.
The Lives of Old Dogs, Part 1. Princess Celestia. Once upon a time, before the EBSS and before the longest night, there lived a young Pegasus. His name doesn't matter. This is his story, a tale lost in the sunset of bygone ages, one I've pieced together from hushed deathbed confessions and the centuries-old diaries of ponies who have long since passed. It might not be how it happened. This is how I like to imagine it. Few were those who knew this stallion and fewer still who wanted to remember him. He had given up on his family, just as his family had given up on him. He became a delinquent, a good-for-nothing, a ne'er-do-well. The only things the stallion cared for were the thrill of a fight and another night spent in good spirits, with good spirits. He never thought his life might change. He never thought much about anything. Forget yesterday, live for today, and curse tomorrow, that was his mantra, the creed of his life. For a little over a month now, the stallion had lived on the outskirts of the old city, the courtyard of the castle where my sister and I resided. He spent his days in the forest, sleeping or scrounging for whatever might get him through his lonely hours. Only when the sun set did he begin to live. He made friends, tenuous allies, really, with ponies who were like him, ponies who had turned their backs on Equestria, for Equestria had turned her back on them. Together, the ragtag bunch of hooligans trawled for the unwary of the old city, preying in the shadows of dark alleys for any pony who entered their net. Rich or poor, good or evil, to them it made no difference, all that mattered were the precious bits in their pouch or the loaf of bread and bottle of wine in their basket. Sometimes, they'd find a big fish. Nobles were often too arrogant, or plain foolish, to avoid a shortcut through the back streets of the city. There they would find their carriage's path blocked, their servants' noses broken, and their cabin plundered. On a better occasion, the stallion and his friends drank for a week from the catch. Other times, they were not so lucky. News of the group quickly spread, and Luna's night guards patrolled the night streets vigilantly, their enchanted eyes scanning the darkness as though it were bathed in the light of day. The stallion saw many of his friends captured, but he was better than them. He always got away. He would never be caged. His hoofs shuddered. Not because of the chilling winter wind, but in excitement and anticipation of the night ahead. Tonight would be his last in the old city. When the moon reached its apex along the sky, he met with two others. At the edge of the city, just by the great gates, an old mare made business out of her home by crafting and selling porcelains. She had refined her skills over a lifetime, and her wares became renowned throughout the land. Her shop had seen purchases from the richest of families over the decades. The stallion and his friends planned to break into the shop and make off with as many pieces as they could fit in their bags. What the stallion couldn't carry, he would smash. Not because he wanted to, the stallion could not remember the last time he had wanted anything. He would do it for no other reason than that he could. Half an hour past midnight, the stallion and his friends had filled their bags with the finest ceramics they scoured. When the old mare woke to the sound of shattering vases, the stallion laughed in her face. A single swing at her legs broke a knee. The only thing the stallion respected, after all, was strength. The world trampled all those who were not strong enough. As he locked eyes with the terrified old mare, he imagined himself a force of nature, an earthquake, a hurricane, his actions born not of evil but the will of the destiny that guided all ponies. It was easier that way. A night guard called Silhouette would later tell my sister that he had a hunch. The notorious group had been far too quiet in past days, and he knew their kind, having been like them himself. He was the first to arrive, having heard a muffled scream from the shop. He kicked in the door, and the group froze. Silhouette looked them over.
You are coming with me.
Our stallion sized him up. Silhouette's slit pupils stared back, unblinking, unafraid. His leathery bat wings spread wide. In the night guard's darkly shining chest plate, the stallion caught a glimpse of his own frightened reflection.
Get the freak!
He bellowed, lunging at him. Silhouette possessed a piece of Luna's soul, a gift of initiation given to all night guards by my sister. It was her magic that pushed their minds and bodies beyond the capabilities of other ponies. An army of one, each of them. Silhouette would easily overpower all three assailants, and as his hoof pressed down on the stallion's throat, the defeated pony could not help but look up at the night guard in awe. When Silhouette took him away, he asked how he might become like him. Years would pass until the two would meet again, but the stallion would never forget the face of Silhouette. Princess Luna has spent many a night watching over the dreams of our little ponies. I admired her, she could always find the good in the most wicked of hearts. When she peered into the stallion's mind, she found his soul twisted but unbroken. She saw in him not a heinous criminal to be locked away, but an abandoned child crying for help. To her, there was no such thing as a bad pony. Though bad deeds might never be undone, he could yet do good, and in turn help us all far more than spending his life in a cell ever would. That was Luna's philosophy. To join the Night Guard, a pony would have to give up their body, their name, and indeed, their life. By linking their souls with that of Princess Luna, they pledged to serve to the very end. For Luna, tearing away a part of her own soul to weave it between the threads of another soul had never been easy, but she never let that stop her.
It is a pain worth bearing,
she would tell me. For the stallion, making the sacrifice was simple, for he had never had a life to begin with. Although I did not know who he was back then, that fateful night was when this story, a story that few would ever know, yet would resonate across Equestria, had started in earnest. Swift sweep. The EBSS headquarters and our temporary detainment cells lay within Canterlot Mountain, hidden deeper even than the glowing crystal mines. Well, hidden might be a strong word. Every pony knew it was there. What better way for a mother to scare her misbehaving children into submission by threatening them with being taken away to the mountain's cavernous maws? Heavy Yol hailed from a family of humble cherry farmers down to the southeast, honest work, and a noble occupation in its own right. Why he and his sister chose to trade harvesting fruit for harvesting organs remained a mystery for the time being. With the ever-competent royal guard failing to track down their elusive priestess Nyx, and the young red petal being in no condition to talk, Heavy Yol was our only way to find her. A stallion with a stronger spine would have taken advantage of that fact. Luckily for us, Yol here seemed to possess a simple soul with all of his family's inherent servility. He was tough, but lacked any wit. I knew we could crack him, we'd only have to lean on him. The problem was Celestia leaning on us. She was most disappointed with our performance. We let Nyx slip away, another of our marks nearly died, and the third still wasn't talking. We all knew what it meant when Celestia was disappointed. Old dogs never retired. We had all pledged our undying loyalty to the crowns when we enlisted in the Night Guard long ago. Although Princess Luna was no longer here to guide us, that did not relieve us of our oaths. That is to say, we would continue our work in the EBSS until the day we died. Be a good employee and be rewarded with Celestia's most important tasks, or become a faceless failure, living out our lives in an underground office, filling out forms without once seeing the light of day. Stars knew that Celestia's brave new Equestria needed bureaucrats. Celestia started out disappointed. Now she grew impatient. If we didn't give her results soon, we would all be replaced by her new recruits. To be reassigned was the ultimate insult one could suffer in the EBSS, a testament to your incompetence. Project Heartbreak would remain ours. I knew just how to crack Heavy Yol. I waited in the magically lit hallway before the interrogation room for Riverflow to finish his shift in questioning him. Though I did not usually pay attention to the royal guards who helped us run the EBSS HQ, I took note of the one guarding the door. I did not recognize him.
You're the new guy, I take it.
He saluted.
Yes, sir.
I did not like new faces, not in general, much less in HQ. This particular guard certainly did not wow me, either. He was short and looked as fragile as a twig, and beneath the golden-plated armor and prideful expression I saw no substance. Truly the organization has fallen a long way if they accepted such sorry excuses for stallions.
Yes, I've been told to expect a replacement, I said. Whatever happened to Halberd? I understand he had an accident, sir. Well, let's hope he can return to work soon.
He did not answer that. How smart. I might just start to like you yet. Although I never cared to ask, I had always wondered whether Celestia went out of her way to color-code her Royal Guard recruits, or if they had to ritually dye their coats white before joining the service. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room cranked open, its metallic scrapes echoing across the windowless halls. As it closed behind Riverflow, he put a hoof behind his neck and circled his head. The old, rugged scar on his throat refused to stretch with the rest of his skin, creasing and pulling it all around itself. He gave an exhausted sigh, though to the uninitiated ear it might have sounded like the growl of a wolf dog.
How long have I been in there? About 3 hours.
Turning his head down, he rubbed his throat and gurgled phlegm before swallowing hard.
That makes it 44 for him.
He stretched out a leg, cranking his shoulder. Then he shot me a piercing glare.
I don't think what you're planning is going to work. You're going to completely destroy him, we'll get reassigned, and I'll be blaming you.
Always the critic, River. I didn't think he liked any of us, but he held a special spot of hatred for me in his heart. It had been me who found him with his own spear lodged inside his throat, after all. I had grown used to his jabs, none too subtle as they were.
Grotto put me in charge of the interrogation process.
I did my best to maintain a straight face and a professional tone, no need to sink to his level of petty insults.
I'll ask for your opinion when I need it.
And hoops, a slip of the tongue. His face was as hard as stone, his lips stiff as ever and chin always raised just an inch higher than yours. He looked me over with disdainful eyes before answering.
Impress me, Swift. Or rather, impress Celestia. Mind stepping aside, then? You're blocking the door.
I could have sworn I saw him smirk for just a moment before standing out of the way.
I take it you're about to drop the bomb. I'll be listening.
With that, he turned around and entered the observation room directly next to the interrogation room. With a deep breath, I pushed the steel door open, again sending a wave of reverberations down the hallway. Inside, royal guards on each side of the door saluted my entry. Heavy Yol slouched in his chair with his back to the door, eyes closed, head drooping to one side and jaw hung open. As he began drawing in a deep, slow breaths, I slammed my hoof on the desk in front of him, making him jump. He looked at me with eyes red from a day spent crying, barely able to keep his slack eyelids above his pupils.
Please, let me sleep,
he said, his tongue waggling weakly and slurring every word. The hairs on his muzzle had clotted together from tears, and I could see the irritated skin of the bags under his eyes, red from all the rubbing. I took my seat in front of him and angled the desk's magical light into his face. Mentally, I noted the little blue gemstone embedded into the center of the desk, a piece of enchanted sapphire that transmitted every noise within the room to the scribes, and river flow, on the other side of the wall.
Look at me, number 21,
I said.
What do you know about Priestess Nyx?
He squinted through the light and gave a choked gasp as though trying to sob, but his throat was too dry.
Please, I told you, I don't know anything.
He rubbed his eyes.
Please, just an hour, half an hour. Tell us again.
He choked on another breath, then licked his lips before continuing.
Priestess Nyx. I don't know. We've only ever seen her once.
He sniffed.
We've only ever seen her once, we've only ever seen her once.
Yol had been repeating that, verbatim, ever since we brought him in. A phrase put into his mouth, no doubt, something to fall back on when pressured. By the looks of it, he'd sooner go mad than tell us anything here. We had driven him to the edge of his sanity for a reason, of course, as my plan hinged on him being worn and susceptible. Having not spoken for a moment, Yol's head was already drooping to the side, eyelids slowly descending.
I assume you're concerned about number 20. That is, your sister.
His eyes snapped open, a piece of eye crust peeling off with a crunch. He quickly lurched forward and clambered onto the desk. The guards behind him grabbed their spears, but I stopped them by raising a hoof. Yol dug the tips of his hooves into the desk, his shoulders sticking out as they desperately tried to keep his head up.
Why you know about Red? How's Red?
I slowly shook my head, closing my eyes for effect.
Red Petal is not well, I'm afraid.
Opening my eyes, I saw Yol sprawled out on the desk, eyes speaking of pure desperation and mouth gasping for air.
I need to see her,
he blurted. Hook, line, and sinker. I had interrogated farmers before, they were all, always, about family. I had to keep myself from smiling.
That will not be possible.
He pushed himself up, a newfound flame flaring up in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he looked like he had a reason to fight.
I'm not saying anything until you let me see her. Is that so?
I leaned back, crossing my hooves and sending a condescending glare.
But you have nothing to say, as we've already established. You don't know anything. Why should we let you see number 20?
His facade of strength collapsed along with his body. He caught himself with a hoof before his head hit the desk and spoke through trembling lips.
Please. I need to know she's okay. She didn't do anything, it was all me, I swear upon all the stars in the sky, please.
Now, I'm not saying Earth ponies were all the same, but from experience I've found they had incredibly strong familial connections. A quick background check quickly told us that these two had broken from their family years ago. That was to say, they only had each other. I leaned back, now letting an easy smile show.
I can see you love your sister very much. Yes. Please, just for a minute. It's not her fault. Very well.
I pushed my chair out and stood up, waving to the guards.
We're going to the infirmary.
From Heavy Yol's expression I thought he might have jumped for joy, had he had any strength left. He almost looked grateful. Even a beaten dog will lick your hoof if you cover it in fat. The guards helped lift him from his chair. His legs were weak and wobbly, the guards had to support him to make sure he didn't fall over. As we left the room, a pair of scribes rushed from theirs. Their horns glowed, oars carrying inkwells and papers as quills scribbled mid-air. Riverflow was the last to step outside. I would have loved to gloat at being right, but I could not rightfully do so until Heavy Yol really talked. I couldn't help but think that Riverflow would have found some perverse consolation in our mutual failure. We blindfolded him, as was protocol, and the assembled team escorted Heavy Yol down the dim hallways amidst much pushing and shoving. 3 turns and a flight of stairs above the temporary holding cells lay the infirmary, and inside, our esteemed guest's burned younger sister. Another pair of guards greeted us by the door, and a nurse, surprisingly stockily built for her occupation, stood before Red Petal's bed. Although Yol had been nothing but a chore to get here, his lack of sleep making him very clumsy, when we took off the blindfold he quickly sprung to rush for his sister. The nurse promptly shoved him back.
Don't touch her,
I warned. Yol reared, trying to get a look of Red Petal over the nurse's shoulder. I let him struggle and watched with shameful pleasure as horror dawned in his expression. This was his first time seeing his sister since they separated at the mansion, before Nyx broke free of the inhibitor. Good thing Silhouette wasn't there to watch me, he'd surely have hoofed me across the back of my head. Red Petal had avoided death by a hair, it was a miracle in itself that our doctors managed to stabilize her at all. Much of her skin had been burned to a crispy texture, with only the odd patch of charred hair littering it here and there. She had suffered severe internal injuries and had bled profusely for a long time, and although I wasn't privy to all the details, I had been told that they had to remove splintered bones from punctured organs. For the time being, however, she was alive, and stable. Indeed, with the right drugs and a righteous amount of magic, we could keep her among us for as long as we wished. Pain and delirium prevented her from moving or communicating in any way, though as far as we could tell, her mind was still there. A perfectly healthy, if scarred, soul trapped in the body of a vegetable, and we had the key to the lock. The grim fact of the matter was that Red Petal proved much more useful to us as she was. I considered it a fitting punishment for the things she had done. Her bloodshot eyes moved lazily about, it took her a while before she noticed her brother. When she finally did, her eyes went wide and her lips contorted, her throat making a raspy, incoherent gurgle barely louder than a dying whisper.
Red.
Yol moved to grab her hoof, but the nurse stopped him. He never took his eyes off his sister.
What did they do to you?
I put a hoof on Yol's shoulder, and he froze to the touch. After a moment, he turned to me.
We did not harm your sister. Celestia would never condone harm to her subjects. This.
I waved a hoof towards Red.
This is the doing of Priestess Nyx.
Yol pushed my hoof off, gaping and shrinking away.
No, she had never.
He turned to Red, who in turn moved her head up and down the slightest bit, dragging loose skin over her pillow, her equivalent to a nod. Yol's face scrunched up with pain.
We were doing good. For the greater good. This was supposed to be better.
He swallowed and turned to me.
The children, we're here to mend the world. We're trying to help you, don't you understand? Is torturing ponies mending the world?
I nodded towards Red.
Is this?
He dropped to his haunches, fixing his gaze on the floor.
You just don't understand.
I put my hoof on his shoulder again.
Celestia wants nothing but the best for all her little ponies. Unfortunately, your little sister might not survive.
As Yol turned to me, I saw Red's eye spin my way, too.
Not unless she receives urgent medical help, help that Celestia might be reluctant to offer some pony she can't trust.
Yol kept looking into my eyes, but said nothing. In his gaze, however, I saw the realization gather.
We all want to help you,
I said, pulling my hoof back.
We want you back in your family. Think about them. Do you think they'll want you back like this? No pony welcomes an enemy of Equestria. You have a choice here. It's up to you to make the right one.
I waved to the nurse, and she stepped aside. Yoke jumped up and took his sister's hoof into his.
Do you want to be number 21, or Heavy Yoke?
I asked.
Will you help Celestia, or will you lose Red Petal?
His breathing grew faster, and I saw him clench his teeth under tightly shut lips.
The children of the night betrayed you. Don't play a hero to them. Be one for her.
Yoke burst with sobs, lowering his head and putting Red's hoof to his forehead.
Nai,
he whispered. The scribes quickly perked up, quills at the ready. Riverflow, previously leaning against a wall, now straightened himself.
Louder now,
I said.
Prophet Nai,
Yoke blurted.
Nyx said Prophet Nai would soon come to Canterlot to lead us to the mother. And Nyx loves him. If Nai is coming, Nyx will be at his side. She always is.
Prophet Nai. Indeed, we had heard the name. This wasn't the first time some deranged lunatic gibbered something about this prophet who bound all of the cult together. Nai appeared to be the mastermind behind the entire Children of the Night phenomenon, the priests and priestesses being his most trusted servants. But Nai was a ghost. We had always hoped to one day get our hoofs on him, though until now we focused on cutting the cult apart slice by slice. If Nai really was coming to the city, however, that changed everything. Yoke whipped around and grabbed me by the chest.
But I don't know when he's coming, he cried, or how, or anything, I swear, I don't know. I really don't know.
Spent, he collapsed at my hooves into a pile of tears and incoherent sobs. I nodded for the guards.
Take him away.
A pair of guards picked Yoke up and dragged him out of the room. I turned to the others.
Find me Twilight Grotto. He will want to know all the details. Tell him I'll meet with him in a minute.
They left too, passing by a speechless river flow. I raised my brows at him. That made him frown.
Proud of yourself, aren't you? Why shouldn't I be?
He nodded towards Red Petal.
She is suffering, and you're keeping her that way.
I glanced towards the broken mare. She was eyeing us, too.
This is nothing compared to what her victims went through.
River scoffed.
We're supposed to be better than them. No,
I replied,
we're not. We're here to stop them. What if the princess knew what goes on down here? Every pony knows.
And that's the beauty of it.
You see, that is precisely why we'll never have to explain this to Celestia. She knows, so she doesn't ask.
He stayed silent for a moment. After a deep breath, he nodded slowly, not in approval but in understanding.
She doesn't ask, so she doesn't know. Are you ready?
Twilight Grotto asked. I swept my mane back, straightening my posture. My chest pounded, and I could feel my legs shake. I did my best not to show it.
Am I ever?
On the morning after our breakthrough with Heavy Yoke, Grotto and I had to present our results to the princess herself. The road had not been without its bumps, and I'd lie if I said we did exceptionally well, but all was not lost. We did have 2 out of 3 marks in custody, after all, both properly pacified and compliant. And now we had something to go on, not just to find Priestess Nyx, but the mysterious Prophet Nai as well. With a deep breath, Grotto nodded to the guards by the throne room's doors. Although they weren't allowed to answer, I saw them nod back with encouragement in their eyes. I appreciated that. It was a rare show of compassion. Most ponies did not like the EBSS, although none would have said it out loud. Their horns lit up, and their joint aura crept up the great jewel-studded gates, swinging them open. Grotto stepped forward first. I followed him quickly. The throne room was not at all as I had expected. Thick curtains draped over the great stained glass windows, filtering the morning light and painting the room a dark shade of red. The twin thrones, one for each princess, stood vacant at the other end. Under the sole window whose curtain was still open, Princess Celestia sat by a small table set with a kettle of tea and a number of accompanying cups. As the doors closed, Celestia didn't turn to greet us. Her gaze was set somewhere on the city outside, the gentle light of the sun shimmering on her bright coat and casting a kaleidoscope of colors on the floor as it shone through her flowing mane. Terrified as I was to see her, I had to admire the splendor of the throne room, a stark contrast to the underground quarters and cramped spaces of HQ where the light of the sun never reached. Celestia herself moved with grace and elegance as every single motion seemed to bring with itself the pleasant serenity of a summer afternoon. To a simpler pony, the mere sight of the Princess of the Sun and Moon might have been enough to inspire lifelong awe. Her picturesque exterior belied the determined, ruthless ruler that hid underneath. Me, I've always felt that Celestia looked the most terrifying at her most peaceful. I found my steps becoming shorter the closer we came. Grotto had gone ahead of me. I shook myself and broke my imaginary shackles, hurrying my steps to catch up with him. When we reached Celestia, she didn't turn. We waited a moment, still nothing, then Grotto cleared his throat. Celestia turned to us and gave a few quick blinks as though recovering from a daydream. A warm smile spread across her lips.
I apologize. Please, have a seat.
She gestured towards the two chairs on the opposite end of her table. A warm aura tugged at their backrests, pulling them out for us.
Thank you, Princess,
Grotto said as we sat down.
As you know, we are here to. It is a beautiful day today, would you not say so?
Celestia turned to the window again. There were no clouds in the sky, letting the sunshine unobscured onto the white spires of Canterlot. Grotto and I exchanged a look. If I hadn't known better, I'd have thought the old mare had finally cracked.
Yes, I said, most certainly.
She turned back to us, still with a smile.
I must apologize again. Without my sister and with all this darkness in the world, sometimes I fear I forget about the little things. Like a bright day of sunshine.
She cleared her throat and her smile faded, although it did not disappear entirely.
I understand you have made progress in Project Heartbreak. Indeed,
Grotto replied.
As you are aware, we have successfully captured 2 lunatics in an earlier raid. Unfortunately, their purported overseer priestess Nyx fled the scene through means we do not yet understand.
A cup floated to Celestia's lips, and she took a sip under a raised brow.
After a long interrogation,
Grotto went on,
during which, might I add, no physical harm came to the subject designated number 21, he finally decided to talk. He revealed information pertaining to the leadership of the cult, as well as their possible goals. Our next objective is to evaluate the veracity of his claims. I see,
Celestia said.
Please, go on.
Grotto looked to me, and I gulped none too subtly.
I was the one to coerce the mentioned information from number 21,
I said. I stopped for a moment to gather myself, my voice wavered far too much for my liking.
He talked about one prophet Nye, who is the ostensible leader of the cult. According to him, the prophet and priestess are working together, and Nye is coming to Canterlot sometime in the near future. Wherever Nyx fled, she is bound to return for the occasion. Therefore, I propose that we further tighten surveillance over incoming and outgoing traffic to Canterlot, as well as...
Celestia raised a hoof.
May I ask your name?
The question had come so suddenly, my tongue tripped over itself.
And my name is Swift Sweep.
Celestia stared at me, I had to shoot Grotto a glance, who nodded back.
Once Crescent Strike,
I added. Celestia's expression was that of a proud mother.
Tell me then, Swift Sweep, how long have you been serving the crowns? Oh, well.
I looked to the side, quickly counting in my head.
It's been 24 years now. The first 4 as a night guard, the rest as the first generation of the EBSS.
She looked to Grotto.
You have had a similar career as well, have you not?
He straightened himself, throwing up a hoof to salute.
Twilight Grotto, once Duskin Caverns, at your highness' service.
Celestia nodded.
Tell me then, how did this priestess Nyx salute you?
I glanced at Grotto, and he glanced back, but he didn't say a word. I turned back to Celestia. Her expression held no judgment, yet looking into her eyes chilled me to the core.
And my partner Lullaby, once Night Song, had Nyx pinned with her wing blades. It's a standard restrainment procedure,
Grotto interjected.
It has served us well in the past. Yes, quite right, I said. I put a spell inhibitor onto Nyx's horn, again as a standard procedure. I had, of course, checked the inhibitor prior to the raid and found it in working condition. Yet Nyx somehow managed to power through it, releasing tremendous magic in the form of an explosion that your highness no doubt remembers. I should think you've seen our full report.
Celestia looked down at her empty teacup.
And then she ran away.
Her horn lighting up, the kettle filled the cup. A tuft of magic lifted it to her mouth, and she savored the smell before taking a sip.
I admire you. I might never learn what it is like to age, but I do know that time is not kind to my little ponies. This Nyx was one young, spry mare, is that not right? My armor was damaged in the blast.
I hung my head.
I came close, but I could not catch her. Yet you push on,
Celestia continued, sipping again.
You work tirelessly for Equestria's future, day after day. I am not overstating myself when I say you have not only my admiration, but indeed, my gratitude.
She took another sip, emptying her cup.
Oh, how rude of me. Please, have some tea if you like.
Grotto took the initiative, reaching for the kettle, pouring, and spilling a drop onto the rich tablecloth. He gave the kettle over, for fear of doing it again.
That is why your reassignment breaks my heart.
I froze.
As Princess of Equestria and head of our Bureau for State Security, I have decided to reassign you to, as well as Lullaby, to another project. By placing Project Heartbreak in younger hooves, I aim to ensure such a simple blunder does not occur again. I have no doubt you understand my decision. That is, of course, if you both agree.
Her horn glowed again, and her empty teacup floated over to me. That's when I realized the kettle was still in my hooves.
Please, would you be so kind?
Grotto and I once again exchanged a look. And in that shared moment, we understood. Celestia was not giving us a choice. She liked pretense, but she never gave you a choice. That little cup, floating in shimmering light in front of me, held our futures. If we said no here, slaving in the mines for the rest of our lives would have been among the more merciful fates Celestia would pick for us. One does not say no to the rising sun and watchful moon of Equestria, after all. Grotto nodded, then turned to Celestia.
We agree wholeheartedly.
Celestia smiled at him, then looked to me, lifting the cup slightly. I poured from the kettle and did it with a smile on my lips. The Lives of Other Ponies, Part 2. Princess Celestia. Princess Luna bent the powers of the element of magic to astounding ends. She could not only peer into the very souls of other ponies, but she could also read, even alter, their minds and memories as though they were open books and she had the quill. She could turn and fold the proverbial pages of their minds, undo them at the seams to stitch them together again, or even tear them up altogether. As Luna tapped ever deeper into the arcane and refined her powers over the dominion of the mind, our little ponies grew wary. Her magic cast terror into many a young heart. Although her powers peaked by manipulating the minds of others, in the most exotic of cases her magic extended into physical reality. By sacrificing a piece of her own soul, she could bind that fragment to another pony, intertwining her soul with theirs. But the feeble body of a mortal creature could not contain even a fraction of her powers, and so their bodies changed in accordance with their souls. So were made the night guards, from the ponies rejected by the rest of our kind, all of them petty criminals, thieves, hooligans, and children lost in the night. The Senate attacked Luna mercilessly for shielding these ponies from the punishment they rightfully deserved. But Luna knew better. She knew all they needed was direction. In the Night Guard they could find meaning in their lives, and through honorable service their wretched souls would be mended. Every Night Guard carried a piece of Luna within themselves, and through her they were connected to each other, a bond deeper than friendship, family, or any fleeting mortal love. They were all part of Luna, and Luna was part of them. Yet for all her might, even my sister's magic could not create knowledge where there was none. When Luna approved a pony's application to the Night Guard, they would be sent to train, mentally as well as physically, for 6 months. At the end of their training, Luna would see them again, and they would emerge from the night altered by her magic, with the strength of a dozen and the experience of 100. It was during our young stallion's first week of training that he met a young mare. Her name doesn't matter. They gathered all the new volunteers in an open field at midday, just outside the old city, with night guards watching over them. It was rare to see night guards during the day, and even rarer to see so many at once. The ponies that lived nearby knew to leave well enough alone. Around them, the grass had long since been trampled away through years and decades of use, nothing but dust and earth to crumble beneath their hooves. Silhouette stuck the spiked tip of his wing into the dirt and walked around the two trainees, drawing a circle at a few steps radius.
"This will be your playing field," he said. "When I say go, all you need do is throw your partner out of the ring. Simple. Impress me."
The two inside the circle turned to face one another. As they backed to opposite ends, they sized each other up. The mare was older than the stallion, but not by much, his body sculpted by a life on the streets, hers by an application to the royal guard that was never accepted. He had taught himself to fight, whilst she learned from masters of the craft. She was everything he hated, although he did not know it, a goody two-horseshoes from a military family, the kind of pony, who kept the likes of him down. He was everything she hated, although she did not know it, a good-for-nothing who let his life waste away after his family threw him out, rather than making something of himself like she did when her family disowned her. Right now, all they were to each other were opponents to be beaten, beaten to show Silhouette they were better, beaten out of pride to show to themselves they were not useless. He carved the earth with the edge of his hoof.
Ready to dance, big girl?
She ground her teeth and spat onto the dirt.
I'm always ready, small boy.
Silhouette hid a smirk behind his hoof.
Go.
They threw themselves at each other with the desperation of ponies who had something to prove. They kicked, they bit, they trampled, and dust swelled in the air. Within seconds she shoved him out of the ring and triumphantly planted a hoof on his neck. Even when she took her hoof off, the stallion remained on the ground, burning in the shameful flames of his own inadequacy. Silhouette raised a brow at him. The stallion looked away, huffing at the slowly settling dust.
You're not going to let a girl beat you, are you, son?
He scoffed, getting to his hooves and locking eyes with the mare. She, in turn, took to her fighting stance that the stallion had no doubt she had been spoon-fed in some fancy academy or another. He had bested royal guards before. He wasn't going to let this girl beat him. 3 rounds later, he finally triumphed. By that time, both of them could barely stand on their hooves. Bruises, scratches, and even bites littered their skin, their joints burned, their bones ached, and their lungs felt ready to rip with each excruciating breath. They dropped to the ground opposite to one another, eyes set on those of their partner, waiting for the moment the other jumped. The mare looked away first, turning to Silhouette.
Hey girl.
He shrugged.
It was one way to get the kid motivated.
The stallion turned to Silhouette now.
The kid.
The mare clambered to her hooves, chuckling weakly.
You sure I'm fighting the right guy?
She extended a hoof to the young stallion. He hesitated a moment before taking it and standing up as well.
You wanted to motivate me?
He asked. He dug at the earth again, grinning at Silhouette.
You know, I still haven't paid you back for last time.
Silhouette looked them over, his expression blank. He then walked past them and took his place at the center of the circle. When he turned to them again, he grinned as well, cracking his neck.
Well then. Impress me.
And so the two fought him, giving their all until their bodies gave out. The trainees had already been too weak to overpower a night guard before training started, but they felt all the more proud for trying. Silhouette would go on to write a shining report on the two. 6 months passed, and the stallion and the mare finished their training. When they admitted Luna's soul into their own, they did not merely find a new life, they received new names as well. Crescent Strike and Night Song were inseparable, their mental link stronger than that of any of their peers. With the elder Silhouette to guide them, they would change the world, they thought. In a way, perhaps, they really have, but not till decades past. Swift sweep. Twilight Grotto slammed his hoof onto the table, making our bowls of soup bounce and clatter.
Can you believe this?
News spread fast in the EBSS. To be reassigned was the ultimate insult one could suffer, and by dinner time, every pony knew about us. Grotto's outburst didn't elicit much of a response from the rest of the mess hall, the clattering of spoons continued, no pony turning our way. It was only us old dogs inside, from the first generation, and every pony knew better than to rub salt into the wound by staring. I lifted my spoon to my mouth in an attempt to keep cool and continue with my meal. I ground my teeth for a moment in preparation of opening my mouth, and ended up throwing the spoon back into the bowl, splashing soup everywhere.
After everything we've done.
I pressed my hooves against my eyes with a sigh.
This is what we get.
Grotto hadn't touched his soup.
I'm appalled. Really, I've lost my appetite. Reassign us. Reassign her big fat rump.
Opposite to me, Lullaby ate her meal without a word.
We'll probably get stuck with some boring desk job,
I muttered.
Steam opening letters in a shack,
Grotto grumbled.
This isn't what she promised us at the breaking of dawn. We were supposed to help Equestria rise from the ashes. Make up for the longest night. And she wipes us off like manure from a boot.
Grotto looked to Lullaby.
Don't you have anything to say?
Lullaby lifted her bowl to her mouth, drinking the last drops of soup. She licked her lips clean, then reached for a napkin before returning Grotto's gaze.
You boys are so dramatic.
I gawped at how she seemed perfectly content.
Don't you care at all?
I asked. Lullaby raised a brow, and waited a second before responding.
Since Silhouette isn't here to reel you two in, it appears I'll have to. Consider the following.
She fluttered the one wing she still had, stretching the broken stub of the other.
I, for one, am quite happy to not chase down cultists for a while. Fact is, we're getting old. Good on Celestia for recognizing that. Let the young UNS handle it, I say. Those damn kids.
The words themselves put a bad taste into my mouth.
They don't know anything. They have no idea about us. About what the EBSS is. You're forgetting that the EBSS isn't about us,
Lullaby replied.
That seems to go for you too, Grotto, and I thought you were the smart one. This has never been about us, both of you know that. You should know that.
She cast a stare that made me wish I was back in the throne room with Celestia.
This is all about the princess, she continued. Damage control. She had an awful lot of trash to get rid of, the Senate and us night guards. That's what the EBSS was for. Remove the night guards, get a cleaning crew in their place, neuter the Senate. Everything else is secondary. We are secondary.
Grotto scoffed and crossed his hooves.
This is about basic dignity and respect. We served Luna for however long, then we've served her for 20 years, and this is how she repays us.
Lullaby shook her head, like a mother does at her obtuse son.
She doesn't care. She made the EBSS to get rid of the night guards because she knew none of us would refuse. Now that the night guards are the scapegoats of history, she just wants the EBSS to do its job. We old dogs are a liability. The only reason we're even still around is her conscience preventing her from getting rid of us for good. The unfortunate reality, and I hate to break this to you boys, is that we need her more than she needs us.
She leaned back in her seat, throwing a foreleg over the backrest.
Do I feel insulted? A little. But I'm pushing 50, and quite frankly, I don't mind a little break. Look at you two, bickering like a pair of spoilt brats. Silhouette would be ashamed.
Grotto cast his gaze down at his soup, muttering under his breath.
Thanks, Mum.
I took a spoonful of soup and spent a moment chewing the spoon, mulling over Lullaby's words. She was right, as always, though I didn't feel like saying that out loud. I put the spoon down and turned back to Grotto.
Any word on our new assignments? Nothing yet.
He looked up, craning his neck and suddenly fixed his gaze on something behind me.
Or.
Riverflow entered the mess hall and headed straight for us, a pair of envelopes in his mouth. When he got here, we greeted him with a collective evening. He spat the envelopes onto the table and slid one to Lullaby, clearing his throat.
Evening. Been called by Celestia, said to give you this. I assume you know what it is.
He cast me a glance.
Congratulations. You two get to be on the same project.
He moved to slide the other envelope to Grotto, but Grotto snatched it up before River could reach it and quickly tore it open with his teeth. I leaned back and eyed Lullaby.
So.
She carefully opened the envelope with the handle of her spoon and began reading the contents.
Surveillance job. Regarding the break-in at the archives the other day. Have to head to the archives first for more info and to review the recording of the event. End. Oh.
She lowered the letter, smirking at me.
Looks like I'm going to be your boss, being your senior. I suspected as much. Good thing I like being around older mares.
I picked up my spoon.
Permission to finish dinner first, big girl. Granted, small boy.
She sent me a smile, then ran her gaze over the letter again.
You're being quiet, TG.
Twilight Grotto had his eyes fixed on the letter in his hooves, his expression frozen, his eyes held in understated horror while his lips trembled in a half-smile. After a moment of silence, even Lullaby looked up from our letter. I leaned to peek at Grotto's letter.
What is it?
He placed the letter onto the table upside down, pinning it with a hoof, and glared forward with a blank expression.
Project White Wolf,
he whispered.
It would appear they need a new project lead.
I sat up. Lullaby put her letter down. Riverflow was not fazed easily, yet even he seemed to pale at the name. Such was the effect of Project White Wolf. Grotto didn't have to say anything else. It was a demon of Nightmare Moon's creation, one of many to be unleashed upon the world during the longest night. Yet this one had a special place of notoriety, a place that made even the hardliners of the EBSS quaver. Project White Wolf was our longest-running project, having started right after the establishment of the EBSS 20 years ago. Few field agents could claim to have been on it longer than 1 or 2 years, however. As for those who did, well, they had long got their affairs in order. We had all heard the stories of the ways the beast got rid of his pursuers. Impaled and burned, hanged by her own entrails, posed by strings among mannequins, even one with his spine broken and mouth shoved in his own backside. The White Wolf appeared to take great pride in his own sadistic ingenuity. And now Twilight Grotto, the failed leader of Project Heartbreak, would be next. Celestia could not have found a better way to communicate her disappointment. Lullaby reached out, placing a hoof on his.
I'm sorry.
His hoof jerked back, curling up at his chest.
About what?
He chortled.
That I get to be the one to catch the bastard? I mean, he's been sighted near Canterlot.
He picked the letter up in one hoof and whipped the tip of the other at it, piercing the paper.
Says so right here. This'll be a walk in Canterlot Park.
River remained quiet all throughout. He took a deep breath, straightened his back, and slowly raised a hoof to his forehead. He saluted. I stood up to follow his lead. Lullaby did too. As Grotto looked us over, it seemed like he wanted to say something, but swallowed the word. His hoof went slack and let the letter fall. He buried his face in his hooves, and spent the better part of a minute like that, slouching over the table, rubbing his forehead. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet but there were no marks of tears on his cheeks.
Did I?
He whispered.
Did I ever tell you why I joined the Night Guard?
I remembered asking, but never receiving an answer.
I was young and stupid. As far from nobility as I could be. Didn't stop me from pretending. Sneaked into these posh parties and galas, talking to the fillies. Let's say I got around. Lots of impressionable young mares out there. Lots of little flings.
He laughed briefly before choking on his breath.
Never stayed for the morning, of course. I just wanted to have fun.
He sighed deeply.
Then one of them found me. She actually found me. She was one of the finer catches, too, a Germain noble on her father's side. And pregnant, apparently.
He clapped his hooves on his chest.
I realized her daddy was going to make an example out of this little scoundrel. Probably her, too. She asked us to run away together. I ran away alone. And you can guess the rest.
He leaned back in his chair to stare at the ceiling.
I remember seeing her with a brat during the longest night, and I remember.
He massaged his temples.
She didn't recognize me. I remember letting them run away cause it was more fun. I think they survived. So that's lucky.
He rubbed his eyes, then looked at us.
I've always been lucky. You'll pull through,
said Lullaby. I nodded.
If there's any pony who can catch that monster, it's you.
Riverflow coughed, swallowed, then spoke.
I hope it'll be quick.
Grotto chuckled.
Yeah.
He pushed his chair out, throwing it aside as he stood up. He didn't look at us after that, he just walked for the exit with short, dragged steps.
So do I.
There was no time to mourn for Grotto. We had a job of our own, and I thanked whatever powers that existed for getting the boring one. It was late evening by the time Lullaby and I got to the lunar wing of the Canterlot Archives, accompanied by a squad of royal guards. Chilling night air flowed in through the enormous hole that gaped where the intricate window used to be in the ceiling. Thick iron bars covered the hole, so as to prevent unwanted ponies from flowing in too. One of the bars was of a slightly different color than the rest, and perhaps just a bit thicker, too, a replacement for the broken one, no doubt. Guards swarmed all around us, flying this way and running that way, methodically examining every shelf and cataloging what they found. As a guard rushed by, I noticed a small black patch on the parquet nearby, as though the wood had been burnt. A guard came up to us and saluted. I could not properly gauge his age, but younger than me. He seemed a spindly, thin sort, his armor rattled something awful as he walked, its pieces barely meeting where they should. A single sun gold stripe painted across his right pauldron told me he had traded fitness for rank. Inherited, in all likelihood.
This is where it happened,
he began. His voice was surprisingly deep for his frame.
The thief, or thieves, have stolen multiple books over an indeterminate period of time. It was only last week that one of Celestia's scribes realized a number of books were missing from the archives.
Lullaby raised a brow.
How could they have pulled that off, breaking into the archives on multiple occasions?
The guard shifted uncomfortably, but didn't avert his gaze. Lullaby turned to me.
How are curfew laws again? They're being changed so often, I lose track. I don't think we have curfew right now,
I replied.
Princess Celestia is honoring her sister's memory.
Until she decides to change her mind again, I mentally added.
With all due respect,
the guard interjected,
what's done is done. We should look at the task ahead of us. Go on, then,
urged Lullaby. The guard waved a hoof high, and 2 other guards walked up to the center of the room, their horns lighting up. Their auras descended like fog onto the parquet directly under the barred opening and crept between the minute cracks between the floorboards. 2 of the boards lit up, rising and floating a step's distance in opposing directions before placing themselves on the floor. They revealed a large blue gemstone hidden beneath the parquet, at least the size of my head, chiseled into an eyeball. Lullaby bent down to have a closer look.
That's when you installed an eye crystal, I take it.
The guard nodded.
Princess Celestia wished that we catch the culprit in action. We did not know when the thefts took place, or even if it had been a one-time deed. Regardless, we spent several nights on alert, and our efforts paid off a few nights ago. Did they?
I asked.
Had you caught the culprit, we wouldn't be here.
The guard cast his gaze aside for a brief moment.
Regrettably, we could not apprehend the thief. The princess said this might be to our advantage, however. By all accounts, she is not aware we've seen her face. Well then,
Lullaby said,
let us see. Yes, ma'am.
The guard cleared his throat, turning away from us.
Listen up, fillies.
No guard had paid us any mind up to this point, they weren't supposed to stop working, not even for the EBSS, but now they all turned our way. Runners stopped dead in their tracks, Pegasi that were in the air slowly descended, and the ones with books in their hooves quietly slipped them back onto the shelves.
We are showing the recording,
the guard continued, voice booming across the entire wing.
Sit on your hooves.
A round of nods and muttered yes sir later, the room fell completely silent. Seeing his effect on the other guards, I thought maybe this guy had earned his rank after all. The guard turned back to us, setting his hooves and thrusting his horn forward. As he closed his eyes, I saw his lips part to reveal clenched teeth, brows furrowed with concentration. First, a pale blue spark crackled at the tip of his horn, then, the entire horn burst with light. My ears started to ring, and a moment later a thin beam of deep blue light shot from the guard's horn into the sapphire eye buried in the floor. The magical lights that illuminated the lunar wing extinguished themselves one by one, surrendering the room to the darkness of night. Above, stars winked out in the sky and the moon itself grew dim before disappearing entirely. Then, from the pitch darkness, the eye in the floor came alive with an eerie glow. A burst of magic surged from the crystal, spreading out across the floor and every surface inside the room. It washed over the pillars that held the ceiling, the many shelves and every book they held, all the while ignoring us ponies. Whatever the magic touched took on an ethereal glow somewhere between blue and green. Magical lights relit themselves in the same strangely tinted color. In the ceiling the window reappeared, and blue-green moonlight began pouring through the stained glass. A tiny point of light appeared not far before me. It took me a second to recognize it as the glowing horn of the guard.
This is when she entered, he said.
Behind me, the ghostly image of the gate opened up, and a spectral pony sneaked in. It was a large form. When I first saw, I could have mistaken her for a stallion. She skipped to the middle of the room, passing right through me with a childlike joy in her steps. Every step of the way, she pulled smudged, inky shadows through the air that took a second to disperse. The clopping of her hooves sounded strange and distorted, distant even, almost like I was listening to them underwater. She stopped for a moment under the window to flick her long, thick mane back behind her ears. As she began turning in place, her ghastly visage creased first into a slight smile, then a full-blown grin. Arching her back, she spread her wings wide and took off. The guard, Lullaby, and I followed the spectre through the room. For the time being, she stayed on the ground floor. From her bag she took out a piece of parchment, the contents of which were far too smudged to make out. After a quick look through it, she seemed to know exactly where to go. From the way she scanned the paper, I guessed it contained her instructions.
She takes a book here,
the guard explained.
Then she flies upstairs to get another one. It's safe to assume she would have taken more, had we not disturbed her.
The spectre did as the guard said, though I could easily follow her through the air as she went upstairs for the second book. One-winged lullaby and the poor wingless unicorn had to scramble up the stairs to keep up. The spectral mare slipped a book into her bag, then a replacement onto the shelf. She hopped to perch on the rails overlooking the lower level, spreading her wings for balance. That's when the gate began glowing brighter, sparks of magic crackling through the keyhole. The ghost's expression changed in an instant from playful excitement to dead seriousness. She kicked herself off the balcony with burst of speed, leaving behind wisps of vapor. She slammed into a shelf to tip it right at the gate. As I followed the action in the air, the guard tugged lullaby to the lower level.
There's the enchanted gem,
the guard said as the spectre pulled out a red, glowing crystal from her bag. She put it against one of the bars that covered the window, and the bar took on a red hue as well. A sudden bang on the gate made the mare's wings skip a beat, the gem falling out of her hoof in turn. She dove and reached for it, but not fast enough, the gem eluded her grasp. It split against the floor where I had seen the burnt patch, red heat spewing from the crack like water from a burst pipe. A blast of magic knocked the tipped shelf away from the gate. The spectre rocketed through the air to kick it right back, and then she flew up to the window again. She wrapped her hooves around the damaged bar, and I saw her face screw up with pain as she began pulling. Her wings spread wide, beating fast and hard to add every last bit she had. The bar first bent, then broke with a snap where she had held the gem to it. Without a moment's rest, the spectre joined her hooves together and began banging on the point of the break, with all the desperate strength of a trapped animal. Every hit against the cold metal bent it more, and every hit elicited from behind the spectre's clenched teeth a scream that was a little louder than the one before. The ghost's voice reverberated oddly from the walls, seemingly from different directions every second. When there was just enough room to barely fit her frame, the spectre kicked out the window and fled through the gap formed by the broken bar. When the army of ghostly royal guards finally broke into the lunar wing, mere seconds later, they were already too late. In a flash of light, the spectres disappeared, but the room remained dark.
That's it?
I asked as I descended. The guard led Lullaby to the center under the window to join with me, a tiny spark at the tip of his horn lighting the way.
It is,
he said.
It is also more than enough.
His horn flared with light, shooting a thin beam at the eye crystal. Colors began swirling all around us, blurry images of ponies whizzing by amidst broken, distantly echoing sounds. The surge of magic died off, and the image of the spectral mare reappeared, standing still as a statue at the center under the intact window, her grin shining in the moonlight.
We're going back to the start,
the guard explained.
This is the culprit as she entered. I ask you both to take a good look at her.
Lullaby and I exchanged a look before stepping forward. Although details were smudged, from the greenly glowing picture one could still make out the general outlines of the thief's features. Long mane and tail, as luscious as they were thick, with individual hairs sticking out all over like from the coat of a wire-haired dog. Lullaby stepped next to the spectre, head to head, and sized her up. She then took a step to the side, stepping inside the spectral form, and coming up smaller in every dimension.
She's humongous. What are they feeding the kids these days? She doesn't look that young, does she?
I leaned into the spectre's face with a hoof on my chin as Lullaby stepped out.
Mid-20s, maybe? Although, that's an awfully round face for an adult. Definitely a kid. That saddlebag doesn't look too light either. Must have been filled with books.
She turned to the guard.
Blanks, you said?
Yes, he replied.
She replaced the books she took with blanks to make the thefts less apparent. What's with the bracelet?
Lullaby pointed to the front right leg of the spectre, a chain of tiny baubles hung there, strapped tightly around her fetlock.
We don't believe it to be magical in nature,
the guard said.
It would be glowing if it were. Now, do you believe you've taken a good enough look?
I eyed the spectre up and down.
I don't recognize her, if that's what you're asking. It's especially difficult without seeing true color. It is not what I'm asking.
Although the darkness made it difficult to make out the guard's face, I could have sworn from the way he formed his words that he was smirking. Presumptuous little fiend. The light dancing at the tip of his horn followed the sway of his head as he turned the other way.
Prof, you're up.
hoof steps. A small bump, and a muffled "Excuse me." From the darkness emerged an older-looking fellow, his monocle shone in the magical light. The guard raised a hoof as he approached.
"This is Golden Monocle,"
Lullaby said, extending a hoof to the professor.
"Ah, so you do remember,"
Monocle said through a forced smile as he Lullaby's hoof. I extended a hoof as well.
"But of course. You are an exemplary citizen of Equestria."
I've been told about my uncomfortably firm hoof shakes. The hoof of the prof felt as cold and limp as a dead fish, and he was quick to pull it back.
"YT, thank you. I must apologize, as do not seem to remember your names." "Ma'am will do,"
Lullaby said.
"Sir,"
I added. The professor gulped.
"Yes, I see."
Being a professor at Canterlot University, to the students he was king of life and death. Our presence, however, reduced him to but a stuttering little colt. I always found that curious. As a long-time informant of the EBSS, he of all ponies had nothing to fear from us. I mean, we knew for fact he didn't. The guard levitated a sheet of paper before us and shone a magical light on it. From the sheet, the picture of a young mare looked back at us.
"This is a sketch based on the recording inside the eye crystal. Please compare the sketch to the crystal's projection." "They seem very much alike to me,"
I said.
"As they do to me,"
Lullaby confirmed. At the flash of the guard's horn, the sheet rolled itself up.
"Thank you. We brought the professor in to help us identify the culprit. He claims to recognize her."
Golden Monocle cleared his throat and adjusted his emblematic eyepiece before speaking.
"Yes, indeed. It would be quite hard to forget. Miss New Page has made quite an impression on me. She was especially interested and, might I add, knowledgeable in the topic of the longest night." "New Page?"
A tingly feeling at the back of my mind told me I'd heard that name before.
"Oh, that New Page?"
Lullaby asked.
"Yes, the name's crossed my desk. She's been on our list of potentially disruptive individuals for years now."
She leaned closer to me, muttering under her breath.
"Right under Storming Falls, remember?"
I slapped a hoof on my face.
"Oh, don't even mention that guy."
Lullaby shook her head slowly.
"It's always the promising young ones. Talk about falling from grace. Such a shame." "A shame indeed,"
Monocle said with a sigh.
"I was very much looking forward to teaching her. Now."
He looked to the guard, then back to us.
"Will that be all? I have important business of my own, and it is getting late. I've already given my full account. I believe the Royal Guard should have the transcription."
The guard answered by turning to us. Lullaby shot me a look, and I returned her gaze. Lullaby looked back at the guard.
"I believe this is what we came for." "Very well, ma'am."
The guard threw up a hoof and whistled, and another guard swiftly trotted over, throwing himself to attention as he stopped.
"Escort our guests out. Make sure that sir and ma'am receive all the necessary files."
Then he set his hooves again and fired his magic at the eye crystal. The spectre's image dissolved like a puff of smoke, as did the ethereal glow that enveloped everything. After a moment of pitch blackness, the stars came aflame in the sky, and the moon reappeared from darkness veil. Flash by flash, the magical lights that shone inside the lunar wing all burst to life as well.
"The EBSS thanks you for your help,"
said Lullaby.
"I don't believe I need to tell you that as far as the Royal Guard should be concerned, this case is closed. You've never heard of it."
The guard smirked, this time fully visibly in the light.
"Heard of what, ma'am?"
He saluted. Lullaby saluted him. I was never one to respect Royal Guards, not in my time in the EBSS or ever before, but now I felt pressured to salute as well. I followed Lullaby's example, then we turned to our escorts. I could almost feel Silhouette pat my shoulder. It was good that Lullaby was still around. She really did keep me in check. Tiny apartments dotted the southern mountainside like cells in a beehive. They were temporary places of residence for the workers, students, and other ponies from the lower castes, quite disruptive, I found, to Canterlot's projected image of being a hub for only the richest and most powerful. New Page left home at the break of dawn, right at the start of the great morning rush. Pegasi swarmed in the air as the earth ponies and the occasional unicorn scrambled past one another, making their way down the steep slopes into the streets. The two of us had spent the night in the vacant apartment directly above New Pages, spying from the window for our target to leave. Once she was gone, we got dressed in uniforms of common construction workers. I attached a toolbox to my belt whilst Lullaby threw a bag over her shoulders and got a paint bucket's handle between her teeth. With our ragged, blotched overalls, we were rendered entirely invisible to the eyes of the rushing crowd. Our younger contacts at the university described Paige as a meticulous young filly, attending as many classes as she could, spending any downtime in the public wings of the archives. Today, she wouldn't be home until early evening. Lullaby looked into the mirror on the wall, adjusting her hard hat and tightening her saddlebag.
Ready?
I saluted, a formality, really, since she was the leader of the two-pony project Bookworm, and Lullaby nodded back, then went for the door. I locked up behind us, and we quickly made our way down the sloped path to New Page's apartment. Lullaby picked out a tiny red gem from her pocket, bouncing it in her hoof once before pressing it against the keyhole. Tendrils of magic extended from the gem and crawled into the hole. After a few clicks and metallic clatters, the lock clacked, opening the way for us. Once inside, Lullaby pocketed the gem and threw her bag down. She fished out a sizable scroll, unrolling it to pin it against the wall, a house plan for the apartment. Not much to be seen, really, as New Page's home consisted of but 3 rooms, the bathroom, whose door stood directly opposite to the entrance, a living room on the right, and a narrow corridor that connected them.
All right.
Lullaby poked a hoof at the parchment, onto the bathroom.
I'll do this one and the anteroom. You, the bedroom, and you'll set the eye crystal. 10 minutes. Yes, ma'am.
No use wasting words, we had both done this a dozen times before and knew exactly what our job was. I wagered we'd be done in 5. Our more magically inclined friends back at the labs of HQ have already done most of the work for us. I liked taking a quick look around before I got to work, not that we were here for a thorough search, but one could always find something interesting. The smallest little details often revealed the most about the lives of other ponies. I turned into the bedroom, stepping over the old, cracked parquet onto the rug thrown in the middle. In its better days, that rug may have been quite pleasing to the eye. Under layers of dust and pieces of paper with half-done notes and scrawls, I recognized what seemed to be embroidered shapes of ponies and stars. I didn't know Canterlot to provide much in the way of furnishing for these apartments, a memory brought from home, perhaps. To call this place a bedroom, I found, was a misnomer. Living room would have been far more apt, inasmuch that New Page indeed had to live in this tiny space. The bed was short and narrow, barely big enough for a pony, nevertheless one of her size. A careless turn in midnight hours could easily send her rolling over the side. The plain mattress showed signs of considerable wear and discoloration from years of sweat, with the rough shape of a pony, sunken into its material. A single window let the morning light flood in. I quickly closed the curtains. Under the window was a desk packed with books and parchments. A quick scan revealed titles ranging from history through geography to astronomy and beyond. By the titles and short notes I glanced at, Paige appeared keenly, and unhealthily, interested in the stars and the mare in the moon. A laundry list of skipped payments and a hastily scrawled note revealed she was saving up to buy a telescope. A bookshelf took up most of the wall opposite the bed, wide and packed to near collapse, with many more books thrown into a pile at its base. The cramped room appeared even smaller than the house plan had let on. No wonder Paige preferred to spend her time away from home. I took a peek under the bed, and pulled out a book. Evidently Paige had not anticipated any unexpected guests, else she'd have hidden it better. It seemed much thinner, and far less battered from extensive use, than the rest of Paige's reading, one of the stolen books, no doubt. I blew off some dust to read the title. Memoirs in the Night, by Silhouette. I felt a cold shower on my back. My hoof tensed its grip on the tome. I'd never have thought I'd see this book again. It was a short account of Silhouette's memories from his service in the Night Guard, finished but a month or so before the longest night. He could never afford to have it printed, and now that Celestia wished to bury anything relating to the Night Guards of old, it would truly never see the light of day. This was the only copy out there, as far as I knew, written through grueling effort by mouth and hoof by Silhouette. And if it weren't for Paige, it'd be rotting in the archives, unread and forgotten. I scoffed. As if gathering dust under a bed was any better. And who knew where all the other stolen books went? I wanted to put the book back, but I couldn't do it. I just couldn't let go. The more I tried to release it, the harder my hooves gripped the covers. It was a flimsy binding, and even flimsier paper, all that Silhouette could afford. The payment for a night guard service, after all, was service itself. A bigger sneeze would have ruined the whole thing. He had always bugged me to read it. He had a chapter about the ne'er-do-well he caught and turned into a stallion from Little Colt, but I never managed to get myself to it. I certainly had no time now. I closed my eyes and pictured Silhouette before me. He'd have been proud of me, I think, for carrying on. Rest well, old friend. I put the book back where it was. No need to arouse suspicion. Undoing the latch that bound my toolbox, I let it fall onto the floor. The top opened up and exposed the dozens of tiny blue gems that glittered inside. I picked one out. Now then, where do I put you? The large bookshelf seemed a good bet. We'd always need places with good vision, and seeing whatever page was reading at any given time would be most useful. In the tiny room, one could almost reach the ceiling just by rearing on their hind legs, but just almost. I had to flap my wings and carefully hover to comfortably work on the ceiling. Books opened and their pages fluttered in the wind my wings created, papers and notes flying about everywhere. The ceiling was the mountain itself, really. The architects of these apartments didn't bother to cover the stone in any way after they bored this hole that some begrudgingly called an apartment. Its surface was rough and uneven, with many minute angles and depressions all over. I picked a spot where I could angle the crystal at the shelf. The gem itself was barely bigger than a tooth, hardly noticeable even without the myriad obfuscating enchantments the unicorns had wrapped around it. Touching it to the stone, I pressed hard to signal activation. The crystal flashed with a dim blue light. When I pulled my hoof back, the gem stuck to the ceiling. I blinked once, and it disappeared from my vision completely. I confirmed that it was in the right place with a tiny poke with the tip of a hoof. The crystal pulsed into my vision before fading into nothingness again. One down. The trick was to planting scrying crystals was that they had to create, altogether, one cohesive image of the apartment. Lullaby got done with the bathroom before I finished here.
Are you quite done yet?
She asked, leaning against the bedroom's doorframe.
Yeah,
I grumbled as I reared on Paige's cluttered desk, trying not to knock anything off while fiddling on the ceiling.
Can't seem to get this one to stick.
Lullaby tapped her hoof.
I'm fairly certain our 10 minutes are up. And I'm not. Fight me, big girl. I beat your sorry rump all the way to the old city last time, small boy.
I didn't hear her say that, of course, I was too busy with the crystal to pay attention. With a flash and a blink, the last blue crystal disappeared. I clapped my hooves and hopped from the desk.
Is it weird if I kind of like doing this? Makes you feel powerful, bugging some ponies home, doesn't it?
Lullaby smacked my head.
They're not bugs, they're advanced scrying crystals. And we're not here to live out your dirty power fantasies, but to serve Celestia.
I rolled my eyes.
Yeah, I'm sure it's in Celestia's best interests that we watch this little filly while ponies like Nyx and Nye are out there.
A sly smirk appeared on her lips.
Do I detect some faint resentment towards our glorious leader?
I chuckled.
Of course not, who do you think I am? No, all I'm saying is I think it'd be wiser to send a squad of royal guards to the university and arrest her on the spot. I'm sure she'd love to tell us everything she knows. And the second we do that, whoever she's working for will disappear.
She shook her head.
I know you're not being serious, but come now.
I dropped onto the dirty carpet and crossed my hooves. Not even 10 minutes in this place, and it was already depressing. The thought of having to watch it for days on end made me feel incredibly uncomfortable.
I just hate sitting on my hooves.
Lullaby sat down beside me and clapped a hoof on my back.
Look. I'd like to bust in and grab her as much as you, believe me. In fact, I'm fairly certain Celestia knows this.
I rolled my eyes.
Doesn't she always know best? Yeah. And that's exactly why she ordered us to sit and do nothing. She's not entirely pleased with us, in case you've missed it. She gave us a pity assignment while the puppies do the real work. Now, if Nightmare Moon herself comes through that door, all we do is write it down, report it, and leave it for them to figure out. That's our job, nothing else.
She craned her head to look directly in my eyes.
You got that? I'm asking as your boss now, have you got that?
I saluted the wall in front of me.
I'm good at following orders.
Lullaby sighed and stood up. From the corner of my eyes, I saw her shake her head.
Just get the eye crystal and let's get out of here.
We had left the paint bucket in the anteroom. Unlike what the label said, however, this one contained not Sky Shines Sky Blue, the prettiest there is, but a single blue crystal cut into the shape of an eyeball, much like the one we had seen at the archives. The difference was merely one of size. Paige's apartment was smaller than the lunar wing, and so its fitting eye crystal was no wider than my hoof. Lullaby detached a saw from her harness and clenched her teeth on the handle.
"The rug,"
she mumbled. I pulled the worn rug away, slowly and gently, exposing the dust-free center of the parquet. Lullaby quickly got to work with her saw. She slid the blade between the planks and cut carefully along the line. She quickly sawed around a plank, then stuck the saw underneath to force it up from the floor, exposing the hard stone underneath. She nodded her head to the hole. I nodded back. Careful not to touch the bottom of the eye, I angled its pupil directly upwards and touched the gem to the exposed stone. Though I had done this many times, I still felt somewhat anxious. You could easily lose a hoof with this thing. Standing up, I put my front hooves onto the crystal's pupil, pressing down hard with all my weight. The crystal flashed under the pressure and began sending tremors down into the stone. The tremors intensified, and the layer of stone directly under it crumbled to pieces. The eye crystal's magic ground the mountain stone into fine dust, digging deeper and deeper. I heard the books patter lightly on the shelf at the back, and the parquet vibrated under my hind hooves. The crystal itself, though, made no sound as it pummeled its way into the stone. When the pupil of the eye came level with the stone, I took my hooves off, and the tremors stopped. I knocked on the eye once, making it light up with a flash. At the same moment, every scrying crystal inside the apartment flashed as well. I slid the removed plank back into its place.
"And that's that."
Lullaby clapped her hooves.
"Finally. I'll put the rug back. You go upstairs and check the mirror." "Yes, ma'am."
I left the apartment, exiting onto the hillside. Lullaby quickly closed the door behind me. I quickly walked up the slope into our vacant apartment above New Pages. This one was even smaller than hers, nothing but one room, almost entirely unfurnished. The only thing of note, the only thing, really, was the standing mirror at the back, taking up most of that wall, and the desk and chair facing it. A small blue gem was embedded into the top of the mirror's frame. One knock on it, and my reflection disappeared to give way to something entirely different. In the mirror appeared a top-down picture of New Page's apartment, the vision of every scrying crystal composited into one cohesive whole. It was not like looking through a window, but more like looking into a dream. Angles were skewed and colors blotched in places, and the surface of the mirror appeared to shift and ripple slightly like a pond in light wind. That's the price we had to pay for not having a slave unicorn keep up a perpetual scrying spell, though. Celestia had to go and outlaw that in her infinite wisdom and kindness. I had vague memories of the old slave who had read to my blind grandfather before illness took him. In our case, I supposed, enchanted crystals were indeed cheaper. Lullaby looked up directly into a crystal, and threw it into my eyes.
"You got it."
She put up a hoof, smirking.
"How many legs am I holding up?"
I couldn't answer her, of course. But for the most part, it seemed to be working. We had properly bugged, I'm sorry, crystalled, the most important spaces. Though I couldn't help but notice that the crystal above the desk was out of focus. I couldn't quite make out the titles of the books lying on it, though by all account I should have been able to. We'd have to fix that. I left the vacant apartment with that in mind. Down the slope, I knocked on New Page's door. 2 knocks, then a pause, and then another 3, the code that signaled it was safe to open up. Just as I was about to step inside, I heard a voice behind me.
"Excuse me."
Turning, I saw an earth pony, mare, older than I was, with a woven basket in her hoof that held many bouquets of flowers. The mare craned her head to look into the apartment, but I stepped up in front of her.
"Isn't this New Page's apartment?"
she asked, trying to look past me.
"I'm sorry, I just picked some flowers down the way, and..."
Lullaby didn't skip a beat. She stepped outside, closing the door and walking up to the old mare.
"Indeed. Miss Page hired us to do a little bit of renovation."
She adjusted her hard hat.
"Nothing to get hung up on."
The mare nodded, but furrowed her brows.
"Oh, I see, dear. It's just that."
She tried looking through the window, but found it blocked by the drawn curtains.
"She never mentioned it, is all. She's so nice, though, she always takes the time to talk. And I didn't realize her scholarship could cover something like this."
Before Lullaby could respond, I cleared my throat.
"Your name wouldn't happen to be Pine Greens, would it?"
She looked me up and down.
Why yes, that's me. Who might you be? Your husband's work up on the spire is quite noteworthy. Few shed as much sweat as Heavy Hammer, despite his age. He really doesn't spare himself. I assume it is because your daughter Inky Mane failed to secure a scholarship for her rhetoric studies.
Pine Greens shrunk away, and the dawning horror behind her eyes told me she realized who I was, and who we were. Personally, I did not enjoy scaring old ladies, but sometimes, that was part of the job. The thing about the Secret Service is that every pony knows it exists. It wasn't that the EBSS watched everything. It was that every pony had to know we watched everything. I leaned closer to her.
Now tell me, if you would, and be honest. Would you be able to pay for your daughter's education if Heavy Hammer were to lose his job?
She gulped, meekly shaking her head and chewing her lower lip.
Not a word to any pony. Do we have an understanding?
She opened her mouth but failed to speak, and resorted instead to a slow, measured nod. She quickly lifted a hoof to hide her wavering lips, like I couldn't see.
Thank you. You will be compensated for your cooperation.
I turned for the door, placing a hoof on the knob before sending Lullaby a nod. We left the stunned mare outside and locked up behind us.
Wow,
was all Lullaby could say. She knew as well as I that was necessary. Sometimes I felt like she was harder on the rest of us than on the potential criminals. I climbed onto the desk, rearing up and feeling along the ceiling to find the hidden scrying crystal.
This crystal is a bit off, but apart from that we're good.
I quickly found the crystal, and moved it a bit back. I stuck it to the ceiling again and waited for it to disappear before getting off the desk. I pulled out the top drawer.
I'm going to do one more check upstairs, see if I can make out everything.
As I began to walk for the door, I shot a glance into the drawer, and froze. There was a bracelet inside, a chain of shiny little baubles, just like the one worn by the spectral mare at the archives. Not that we needed any more confirmation that we had come to the right place. No, I paused because of something else. Although I did not realize it back in the archives, I could see it plainly now. I picked the bracelet up, inspecting it. I knew whose bracelet this was. My breath started coming up shallow. Lullaby stepped over.
What is it? What's that?
I spoke without taking my eyes off the bracelet.
Do we have new pages file here?
She reached into her bag and fished around for a moment. Finally, she handed over a parchment. I quickly scanned the file, looking for her mother's name, hoping desperately to be wrong. But I wasn't. New Page was born 2 weeks before the longest night, as the daughter of one veiled quill. I understood, now, why her name sounded so familiar. But that's not possible, I thought. My heart pounded quickly, and the parchment fell from my grasp. My shaking hoof could barely hold on to the bracelet. My legs gave way, Lullaby had to catch me.
Hey, look at me, small boy.
Memories I thought I had locked away resurged like a flood before my mind's eye. I saw the old city burn. I heard Nightmare Moon's laughter in my ears, Veiled Quill's last, soul-rending scream, the baby's cries. I found myself clutching the bracelet. Lullaby was saying something, but I couldn't hear the words. All I could think about was New Page. This could not have been the same New Page. For New Page was dead. I killed her.